Story 1. The Mud Brick Republic, Rome's Humble Beginnings. Before Rome raised marble columns to the heavens, before it ruled over 3 continents and spoke with the authority of emperors, it was little more than a cluster of huts near a muddy ford in the bend of a river. The river was the Tiber. The ford was shallow and prone to flooding. The settlement, it was poor, often damp, and largely forgotten by the more advanced civilizations of the Mediterranean. This was not the Rome of grandeur and legions. This was Rome before it knew it would be Rome. It began, in all probability, not with Romulus and Remus, but with Latins and Sabines, small agricultural tribes that lived in the hills and valleys of central Italy around the 8th century BCE. They built with what was at hand: thatch, timber, and sun-dried mud brick. Their tools were bronze, later iron. Their gods were petty and local, their prayers muttered in fields rather than chanted in marble temples. Their politics were not yet republican, they were tribal, hierarchical, and often violent. But even then, the land whispered something unusual: its central location, its defensible hills, its access to trade routes. These humble beginnings were not noble, but they were opportune. A village among many. The early settlement of Rome was part of a wider network of Latin villages and hilltop communities. These groups competed, traded, and occasionally merged or fought with one another. The Palatine Hill, one of the 7 hills that would later define Rome, appears to have hosted early settlers who built oval-shaped huts with wattle and daub walls. Evidence from excavations shows hearths, pottery shards, and animal bones, remnants of the daily life of shepherds and subsistence farmers. The people lived close to their livestock. Pigs, sheep, and cattle roamed between the huts. The stench of dung mingled with smoke from cooking fires. Unlike the cities of Mesopotamia or Egypt, Rome's early development was not driven by monumental religion or central planning. There were no ziggurats, no pyramids, no imposing walls. Instead, growth happened in fits and starts, usually driven by necessity. Floods would periodically wash away low-lying areas, encouraging settlements to shift uphill. Seasonal migrations for grazing or agriculture led to temporary camps becoming semi-permanent villages. One of the most defining features of early Rome was not its buildings, but its geography. The Tiber River allowed for inland navigation and modest trade. More importantly, the hills provided both defensive advantage and symbolic importance. A village on a hill was safer and seen as more prestigious. As Rome expanded, it absorbed nearby hilltop communities, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. Founding myths, fuzzy truths. By the 6th century BCE, Romans had already begun to mythologize their origins. The story of Romulus and Remus, twins suckled by a she-wolf and destined to found a city, became central to Roman identity. But these myths were not historical records, they were political instruments. The tale of fratricide, Romulus killing Remus, served as an allegory for the violent struggles Rome would face in building unity from chaos. Modern archaeology suggests that, rather than being founded in a single moment, Rome coalesced from a series of neighboring communities over generations. The traditional founding date of 753 BCE is more symbolic than literal. Still, the idea of a divine or heroic beginning served an essential purpose. It provided Romans with a shared story, a sense of destiny, and a justification for their future dominance. Kings before consuls. In its earliest political phase, Rome was a monarchy, though not in the sense of later European courts with crowns and divine rights. The kings of early Rome were more like tribal chieftains or warrior leaders. Their power was limited by clan elders and religious traditions. According to tradition, there were 7 kings of Rome, beginning with Romulus and ending with the tyrannical Tarquinius Superbus. Each contributed to the foundation of Roman institutions. Romulus with the Senate, Numa with religion, Servius Tullius with social order. But these stories are retrospective. They blend memory with legend. What's more certain is that Rome gradually transitioned from kin-based leadership to more formal institutions of governance. The idea of a senate, originally a council of elders, senex meaning old man, emerged early as a check on the king's power. While kings ruled, they did not do so alone. Power was shared, negotiated, and sometimes seized. The rex was both priest and war leader, a symbol of unity but also a potential tyrant. It's telling that Rome's last king, Tarquinius Superbus, was overthrown not for failure in war, but for personal excess and moral failing, a narrative that hints at Rome's eventual embrace of republican values, libertas, virtus, and pietas. Religion and rituals in the mud. In early Rome, religion was not separate from politics or daily life. It was embedded in everything: harvests, oaths, births, and deaths. The early Romans worshipped a pantheon of numinous spirits associated with places, functions, or actions. There were gods of the threshold, gods of the hearth, gods of manure piles. Religion was transactional. You offered wine or bread. The god ensured rain or safety. Temples as we know them did not yet exist. Sacred groves, springs, and stones served as altars. The earliest priests were likely the heads of powerful families. Ritual knowledge was passed down orally and guarded jealously. It wasn't until later that formal priesthoods like the pontifices or augurs emerged. Interestingly, early Roman religion emphasized ritual precision over belief. Saying the correct words in the correct order was more important than sincere devotion. This formality would persist throughout Roman history, even into the empire, creating a society that prized legalism and order. Swamps, sewers, and the Forum. At the heart of what would become the Roman Forum was once a marsh. The space between the Palatine and Capitoline hills was low-lying, flood-prone, and largely unusable. But as Rome's population grew, so too did its need for common spaces: markets, assemblies, and temples. To transform this swamp, early Romans undertook what might be considered their first major civic project, the Cloaca Maxima, or Great Sewer. Likely begun under the Etruscan kings in the 6th century BCE, the Cloaca Maxima drained the marsh and turned the area into usable land. With this came the creation of the Roman Forum, a political and commercial hub that would remain central to Roman life for centuries. The engineering was rudimentary by modern standards, but impressive for the time. Large stone blocks were laid without mortar. Water flowed downward thanks to simple but effective gradients. Maintenance was constant. Labor was manual. Yet this project reveals something profound about early Roman society: its capacity to organize, to build communally, and to invest in infrastructure for collective use. It also highlights a trait that would come to define Rome: its pragmatism. Romans did not worship innovation for its own sake. They borrowed ideas liberally from neighbors like the Etruscans and Greeks. The use of arches, the design of togas, the gods they worshipped, all were borrowed, repurposed, and Romanized. Unresolved ending thought. As Rome emerged from the mud and began building stone temples and draining its swamps, one must ask, how did a simple collection of hilltop villages evolve into a political entity capable of resisting and eventually absorbing its more advanced neighbors? The swamps had been drained, stone was replacing thatch, and sacred fires now burned on stone altars rather than simple hearths. Rome, though still far from an empire, was evolving slowly, methodically, and in many ways thanks to outsiders. This next stage in Rome's journey was deeply shaped by its kings, particularly those of Etruscan descent, whose influence would leave an architectural, political, and cultural imprint that even the Roman Republic and later empire could never fully erase. To understand Rome's rise, we must pause and examine this transitional era when monarchy met myth, and foreign ideas laid the groundwork for future greatness. The Etruscan connection. By the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, Rome began to resemble more than a simple pastoral settlement. Its growing contact with neighboring cultures, most notably the Etruscans, ushered in advancements in architecture, religion, warfare, and governance. The Etruscans, who dominated much of central and northern Italy, were already urbanized and sophisticated by the time Rome was draining its Forum marsh. They built roads, established trade routes, adorned tombs with frescoes, and constructed temples with tiled roofs and elevated podiums. It is no coincidence that some of Rome's most defining early structures, temples, sewer systems, walls appeared during the reign of its so-called Etruscan kings. According to later Roman tradition, several of the final monarchs of Rome were of Etruscan origin, including the famed Servius Tullius and the infamous Tarquinius Superbus. Yet the Etruscans were more than just builders. They brought new ideas of kingship more hierarchical, ceremonial, and centralized than the tribal rule Rome had previously known. Kings now wore the purple toga praetexta, carried ivory scepters, and were preceded by lictors bearing fasces, bundles of rods that symbolized authority and the power to punish. These symbols of Etruscan royal power would live on in Rome's republic and even in its future emperors. Servius Tullius, the reformer king. Among Rome's legendary kings, few left a more lasting mark than Servius Tullius. Though his historicity is debated, the reforms attributed to him suggest an emerging Roman identity built on order, classification, and duty. Most notable was the Servian Constitution, a reorganization of Roman society based on wealth rather than birth. Prior to this, Rome's social divisions had been primarily clan-based, with aristocratic families, patricians, dominating religious and political life. Servius' system introduced census-based classes, allowing property-owning plebeians a more formal role in the army, and to a lesser extent, civic affairs. He divided the citizen body into centurii, each with military and political obligations. Wealthier citizens formed the backbone of the cavalry and heavy infantry, while the poor, grouped into larger but politically weaker centuries, served as light-armed troops or laborers. This structure would shape Roman military and political systems for centuries, and it revealed a central Roman value: service equals status. Servius also expanded the city's boundaries by incorporating the Quirinal, Viminal, and Esquiline hills. He constructed a defensive wall known as the Servian Wall to encircle the growing urban population. Though later replaced by more sophisticated fortifications, it marked a psychological shift. Rome was no longer a scattered set of communities, it was a city, bounded and unified. Religious infrastructure, the temple and the triumph. The Etruscan kings did more than build walls, they built Rome's religious core. The most important of these was the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. Completed, according to tradition, during the reign of Tarquinius Superbus, it was dedicated in 509 BCE, the same year the Republic was founded. This temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was a symbol of state authority, the heart of Roman religion, and the site of official ceremonies, including the triumph, a parade granted to victorious generals. The temple's very existence hinted at a Rome that had grown confident enough to proclaim itself not just a city among many, but a chosen city of the gods. Yet it is telling that the temple's patron, Tarquinius Superbus, became a cautionary figure. His reign was marked by cruelty, arrogance, and disregard for tradition. The most damning story recounted by later historians like Livy was the rape of Lucretia, a tragic tale of personal violation that sparked political revolution. Whether myth or truth, it framed the monarchy as morally corrupt and set the stage for the creation of the Roman Republic. A city in transition. Despite the advancements under the kings, tensions simmered. The aristocratic class, which would become the Republic's senatorial elite, chafed under royal control. The idea of a single man holding imperium, the power of life and death over all others, was increasingly seen as dangerous. At the same time, the plebeian class, growing in number due to migration and expansion, sought more protections, especially as Rome became more entangled in warfare and trade. Early forms of class struggle were already visible, long before the famous conflict of the orders. Still, life for most Romans remained mundane. Farmers continued to tend their fields just beyond the city walls. Artisans crafted goods in open courtyards. Women carried water from communal wells. Children played near temples and watched processions of augurs reading omens from the flight of birds. Every new wall, temple, and street was a sign that Rome was shifting not only in size, but in self-awareness. Roman monarchy, power shared and feared. Rome's monarchy was never absolute in the way later empires or feudal kingships would become. The king shared power with advisory councils, religious officials, and military commanders. While the king had supreme religious and military authority, his legitimacy depended on the approval of the Senate, and the comitia curiata, an assembly of citizen representatives drawn from Rome's early clans. This early form of consultative government would leave a deep imprint on Roman political culture. Even after the fall of the monarchy, the Romans retained a healthy suspicion of concentrated power, yet a deep respect for tradition. They did not erase their kings from memory. Instead, they reclassified their legacy, extracting useful elements while rejecting the form itself. The office of rex would be abolished, but the powers of the king would be redistributed into new offices: consuls, praetors, censors, and eventually emperors. The Romans never fully escaped monarchy. They merely institutionalized it under a new name. The Tarquin legacy. The final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, epitomized the danger of unchecked authority. Arrogant, violent, and dismissive of senatorial advice, he ruled with increasing autocracy. His public works were grand, the temple of Jupiter among them, but his rule was marked by fear. The catalyst for his downfall, according to tradition, was personal rather than political. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, assaulted the noblewoman Lucretia, who took her own life in protest and shame. This event outraged the Roman elite. A movement, led by Lucius Junius Brutus, expelled the Tarquins and vowed never to be ruled by a king again. Thus, in 509 BCE, the Roman Republic was born not with fanfare but with oath and necessity. The kings were gone, but their influence remained. In the structures they built, the customs they reinforced, and the very language of power Rome would carry forward. A city poised on the edge. Rome had transformed from a muddy cluster of hilltop villages into a unified city-state with walls, temples, and a sense of identity. It had adopted foreign innovations, adapted them, and made them Roman. It had developed the rituals, language, and political instincts that would one day allow it to govern not just itself, but an empire. But in 509 BCE, none of this was certain. The Republic was a fragile experiment. The monarchy had left behind both order and trauma. The future would depend on how well the new system of government could channel ambition, curb tyranny, and navigate the tensions between classes, tribes, and traditions. Unresolved ending thought. Could a city that had once knelt before kings now rule itself by law? Or would the ghosts of monarchy and the seeds of empire already be stirring beneath the surface? Rome had cast off its kings and crowned the concept of libertas liberty as its new ideal. But what did freedom mean to a city that had known only monarchy? What emerged in place of kings was not a democracy in the modern sense, but a system that cautiously balanced power between competing institutions, classes, and traditions. It was designed to prevent tyranny, not necessarily to empower the people. We explore the early years of the Roman Republic, its political scaffolding, the friction between patricians and plebeians, and how even in its infancy, the Republic revealed the contradictions that would later define and threaten it. The Republic is born cautiously. In 509 BCE, Rome transitioned from monarchy to republic, res publica, or public matter. It wasn't a revolution in the radical sense. Rather, it was a reorganization of power. Instead of one king, Rome would now be governed by elected officials, guided by law and checked by tradition. The central innovation, the consulship. 2 consuls elected annually would share power. Each could veto the other, preventing unilateral decisions. This dual leadership was a direct reaction to the monarchy. No more lifetime rule, no single head of state, and no imperial robes. The consuls were deliberately hobbled by term limits and mutual oversight. They were granted imperium, the same supreme command authority the kings had, but only temporarily. They led armies, administered justice, and oversaw the Senate. Yet their prestige often overshadowed their actual power, since Rome's political machinery was dense, layered, and increasingly legalistic. Other key offices soon emerged. Praetors, originally judicial officers. Quaestors, financial officials. Censors, who conducted the census and monitored public morals. Aediles, who oversaw markets, games, and urban infrastructure. This hierarchy wasn't just bureaucratic, it was cursus honorum, the course of honors, a structured ladder of political advancement. Roman ambition now had a career path, and aristocrats competed fiercely for each rung. The Senate, power without office. If the consuls were Rome's face, the Senate was its memory. Originally an advisory council of elders from senex, meaning old man, the Senate grew into Rome's most enduring political institution. While technically lacking legislative authority in the early Republic, it controlled finances, foreign policy, and state religion. Senators were drawn from the patrician class, the old aristocratic families who traced their lineage to Rome's founding clans. Over time, plebeians, the commoner class, would gain access to the Senate, but patricians dominated its ethos and tone. Senators spoke in measured, rhetorical Latin. Debates were long, formal, and procedural. Decisions were recorded in the Senatus Consulta, non-binding but highly influential declarations. In a culture that prized precedent, mos maiorum, or custom of the ancestors, the Senate's gravitas was often more powerful than law itself. Patricians and plebeians, a house divided. The early republic was riddled with inequality. Roman society was split along class lines. Patricians, wealthy, landowning elites who monopolized priesthoods, magistracies, and early Senate seats. Plebeians, everyone else, farmers, laborers, artisans, merchants. Some were rich, but they lacked political rights and protection. This imbalance triggered nearly 2 centuries of internal conflict known as the conflict of the orders. The plebeians sought not revolution, but inclusion, legal rights, representation, and protection from aristocratic abuse. The struggle was often quiet and procedural, punctuated by dramatic moments of protest. The First Secession, 494 BCE, plebeians withdrew to the Sacred Mount and threatened to found a new city unless their demands were met. This led to the creation of the tribunes of the plebs, officials elected by plebeians to protect their interests. Tribunes had sacrosanct status and could veto acts of magistrates. The 12 Tables, c. 450 BCE, Rome's first public code of law, carved into bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum. This was a milestone. Until then, patrician magistrates interpreted law privately. Now, plebeians could appeal to published rules, even if they remained harsh or limited in scope. Lex Candlelight, 445 BCE, legalized intermarriage between patricians and plebeians. Licinian section laws, 367 BCE, required that one of the 2 consuls be a plebeian. These victories were hard-won, incremental, and often compromised, but they shaped Roman identity. The Republic presented itself as a mixed constitution, not ruled by one, the few, or the many, but a blend of all 3. Daily life in a growing republic. While elite politics churned in the Senate and the Forum, most Romans lived far from marble debates. The ordinary citizen was a farmer-soldier tending fields in peacetime, serving in the legions during campaigns. Land ownership was the key to status, citizenship, and military service. A small-holding farmer could vote in the comitia centuriata, the assembly of centuries, but his influence was minimal. Still, civic identity ran deep. Roman values emphasized virtus, courage, fides trust, and gravitas seriousness. Even plebeians internalized the idea that serving Rome on the battlefield or in the field was a sacred duty. Women had no political rights but played vital roles in maintaining households and transmitting family traditions. Wealthy women managed estates and exercised informal influence through kinship networks. Religion remained deeply entwined with domestic life. Household gods, Lares and Penates, were worshipped daily, while public rituals involved both sexes. Rome and its neighbors. In the first century of the Republic, Rome was still a regional power, jostling with neighboring Latin cities, Etruscans to the north, and Samnites and Volsci to the south. Rome entered into alliances, skirmishes, and small wars, gradually expanding its influence through military service and colonization. These early conquests were modest but strategic. Rome established colonies, offered partial citizenship, and built roads to connect its holdings. The Roman military system, based on property qualifications, ensured that expansion remained a shared civic project. Soldiers were citizen farmers, and spoils of war often included land distributions. A crucial advantage was Rome's approach to defeat. When Rome was sacked by the Gauls in 390 BCE, the city was nearly destroyed. Yet instead of relocating, the Romans rebuilt. Their stubbornness became legend. They saw adversity as a test of fortitudo strength. Later writers like Livy would frame this as destiny. Rome suffered early so it could conquer later. Rituals of the Republic. Religion in the Republic remained public, procedural, and closely tied to the state. Augurs read omens from bird flights. Haruspices inspected animal entrails. Every political action from elections to wars required divine sanction. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, held enormous symbolic authority. Temples, especially in the Forum and on the Capitoline, served as civic landmarks. The calendar was filled with festivals, sacrifices, and ceremonies. Religion offered social cohesion, reinforcing hierarchies and traditions. Even funerals were political. Patrician families staged grand processions with wax masks of ancestors' images, connecting present leaders to noble lineages. These displays reminded viewers of Rome's enduring greatness and who deserved to lead it. A republic in the making. By the end of the 5th century BCE, Rome had built the skeleton of a durable political system. Power was shared, not concentrated. Offices were time-limited and elected. Class tensions were acknowledged, if not fully resolved. Law was public if still unequal. But beneath this balanced facade, tensions remained. The Republic was stable but fragile. It required constant negotiation, vigilance, and compromise. Its survival depended on shared values, a respect for tradition, an aversion to kingship, and a belief that Rome was destined for more. In time, these values would be tested by wealth, expansion, ambition, and inequality. But for now, Rome had found its identity not as a monarchy, not yet as an empire, but as a republic born of necessity, shaped by conflict and powered by tradition. Final reflection. The mud-brick republic had risen from the hills and the marshes, forging a new path between the extremes of monarchy and mob rule. But in its complex, cautious architecture of governance, one cannot help but wonder, was the Roman Republic truly a safeguard against tyranny or merely a waiting room for the next one? Story 2, Cloaks, Kings, and Conspiracies, the Fall of the Monarchy. Before the Republic could emerge, the kings had to fall. But to understand how monarchy collapsed in Rome, we must first walk among the cloaked figures of Rome's earliest rulers, the legendary 7 kings whose names echo with myth, murkiness, and a peculiar kind of administrative boredom. These kings did not simply rule. They built sewers, codified rituals, divided citizens, and in some cases provoked revolutions. Their reigns are half history, half foundation myth tools later Romans used to understand their origins, and to justify their fear of singular rule. In this section, we'll meet each king, not as romanticized heroes or villains, but as figures in a civic origin story where governance, not glory, was the true legacy. A timeline carved in legend. The seven kings of Rome, according to later Roman historians like Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, ruled from 753 BCE, the traditional founding date of the city, until 509 BCE, when the Republic was declared. Whether these kings were real people, amalgamations, or purely symbolic is uncertain. What matters is that Romans believed in them. They were the imagined ancestors of Roman institutions, each adding a brick to the foundation of Rome's legal, religious, and social structure. Here is the traditional list. Romulus, Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. Rather than great conquerors, these kings were framed by Roman writers as founders of function men who created laws, built temples, dug sewers, and arranged the calendar. In a city obsessed with order and tradition, this was the highest form of legacy. Romulus, 753–716 BCE, the violent founder. Romulus begins the line of kings half myth, half memory. Legend says he killed his twin brother Remus for mocking the city's walls. He then founded Rome, gathered fugitives and exiles, and established the first Senate. One of his more infamous acts was the rape of the Sabine women, not sexual violence in the modern sense, but a mass abduction of women from neighboring tribes to populate Rome. It's told as an origin story of unity, with the Sabine women themselves later mediating peace between their fathers and their Roman husbands. Still, it paints early Rome as aggressive, opportunistic, and unapologetically pragmatic. Romulus disappears mysteriously, said to have ascended into the heavens and become the god Quirinus. Whether he died or was assassinated is left open, perhaps an early Roman nod to the dangers of singular rule. Numa Pompilius, 716–673 BCE, the priest king. If Romulus was the sword, Numa was the scroll. A Sabine by origin, Numa was chosen by the Senate to bring peace and piety. He introduced many of Rome's core religious institutions. The Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the state. The Vestal Virgins, guardians of the sacred flame. The division of the calendar into months and religious festivals. Numa's reign, according to tradition, had no wars. Instead, he organized Rome's sacred laws, prescribed rituals, and established the cults that would dominate Roman public life for centuries. His legacy was not conquest but codification. Romans later viewed Numa as the ideal counterbalance to Romulus' spiritual, where Romulus was violent, contemplative where his predecessor was impulsive. Together, they formed the yin and yang of Roman civic mythology. Tullus Hostilius, 673–642 BCE, the war. After decades of peace, Rome returned to martial pursuits under Tullus Hostilius. He demolished the city of Alba Longa, Rome's former rival and parent city, and absorbed its people. One of the more famous stories from his reign was the battle between Horta and Curiatii, triplets from each city fighting to decide the fate of their states. It ended with the lone Roman survivor feigning weakness to defeat his opponents. Tullus emphasized military discipline, introduced more formal army structures, and constructed the original Curia Hostilia, the Senate House. Yet even he, the most warlike of kings, is said to have died not in battle but by divine punishment. He performed a religious ritual incorrectly, and Jupiter struck him with lightning. The lesson was clear: neglect religion and Rome suffers. Ancus Marcius, 642–617 BCE, the bridge builder. A grandson of Numa, Ancus Marcius was said to embody the balance between war and peace. He founded Ostia, Rome's first port, and built the pons Sublicius, the earliest known bridge across the Tiber. These acts symbolized Rome's new ambitions: commerce, connection, and control of the river. Ancus also expanded Roman territory through colonization, not just war. He settled conquered people on the Aventine Hill, integrating them into the city. This practical inclusion would become a Roman hallmark: conquer, absorb, repeat. He fortified the Janiculum Hill and established Rome's first prison, the Mamertine, suggesting that law enforcement and state authority were becoming more formalized. Ancus was not just building bridges in stone, he was connecting Rome's expanding pieces into a coherent civic identity. Tarquinius Priscus, 616–579 BCE, the first Etruscan king. The Roman monarchy takes a cosmopolitan turn with Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, an Etruscan nobleman who rose to power through charm, engineering acumen, and careful alliances. His rule marked a turning point: the blending of Latin and Etruscan influences in architecture, religion, and politics. Priscus doubled the number of senators, expanded Rome's games, and began construction on the Cloaca Maxima, the sewer that drained the Forum. His public works reflected the Etruscan love of urban planning and spectacle. He also introduced Ludi Romani public games that would become a Roman tradition. Entertainment became a state function, not just private revelry. Rome was becoming a city of public institutions. Servius Tullius, 578–535 BCE, the bureaucrat king. If one king could be said to have built the operating system of the Roman Republic, it was Servius Tullius. Born a slave or low-born outsider, depending on the version, Servius supposedly came to power after marrying the daughter of Priscus and being chosen by the queen to rule in his place. His legacy is the Servian constitution, the reorganization of Roman citizens by wealth and age, forming the centuriate system. This system would later become the core of republican voting and military service. He also conducted the first census, registering citizens and distributing them into social and military classes. It was not an egalitarian system; it preserved patrician dominance, but it was innovative in balancing representation with obligation. He expanded the city again and is credited with fortifying Rome with the Servian Wall, an act of both protection and civic pride. Despite his reforms, his rule ended in treachery. His daughter, Tullia, and her husband, Tarquinius Superbus, orchestrated his murder. Legend says Tullia drove her chariot over her father's body in the street, Rome's most infamous act of familial betrayal, until Caesar's assassination centuries later. Tarquinius Superbus, 535–509 BCE, the tyrant. The final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, was everything the Republic would later reject. His rule was marked by arrogance, cruelty, and the dismantling of advisory bodies like the Senate. He executed rivals, ignored tradition, and ruled without popular support. He did, however, continue building. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill was his crowning achievement, monumental, symbolic, and imperial in tone. But what undid him was not his politics but his family. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped Lucretia, a noble Roman woman. Her suicide and the outrage it sparked triggered a political revolt. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, the Romans overthrew the monarchy in 509 BCE and vowed never to be ruled by a king again. Superbus fled. His name became synonymous with tyranny, his legacy one of cautionary warning. The monarchy had ended not with a war, but with a personal crime that shook the foundations of honor, virtue, and trust. A legacy in law and stone. Despite their dramatic stories, the kings of Rome were remembered less for their personalities than for their institutions. They built the Forum and drained the marshes, established temples and priesthoods, created the calendar and codified rituals, organized military structures and property-based classes. The Republic would retain much of what the kings built, just not the kings themselves. They rebranded monarchy into magistracies, assemblies, and Senate decrees. The vocabulary of power changed, but its architecture remained. Unresolved ending thought. If Rome owed so much to its kings, its walls, roads, laws, and gods, why did it come to despise the very idea of monarchy so deeply? Could it be that the foundations of Rome were too solid, too centralized, to remain shared for long? In the previous section, we traced the mythic and institutional legacy of the 7 kings of Rome, how their combined legends laid the groundwork for the Roman Republic. But the shift from monarchy to republic did not happen through peaceful evolution. It came with blood, shame, and collective outrage. At the center of this turning point stood a woman named Lucretia, a tyrant's son named Sextus, and a nobleman known as Lucius Junius Brutus. In this chapter, we examine the precise sequence of events that triggered Rome's break with monarchy. Not a grand war or economic crisis, but a deeply personal act of violation that turned public sentiment against the Tarquins and against kingship itself. Tyranny takes root. By the late 6th century BCE, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, had established himself as the undisputed monarch of Rome. Though descended from Etruscan lineage, he ruled not with inherited legitimacy but through a coup. He had seized power after the assassination of Servius Tullius, his own father-in-law. Tarquin refused to be confirmed by the Senate and neglected to hold comitia elections. This was no longer the balanced kingship of early Rome, this was rule by fear. His network of loyalists ensured compliance. Dissidents were exiled, executed, or silenced. And yet, like many authoritarian rulers, he invested heavily in public works to curry favor. The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus atop the Capitoline Hill, an imposing religious structure meant to rival anything in the ancient world. Improvements to the Cloaca Maxima, turning swamp into civic space. Expansion of city walls and fortifications. Tarquin's government was centralized, efficient, and intimidating. The appearance of Roman prosperity masked a society fraying beneath. Political voice was restricted. The Senate was hollowed out. And among the nobility, bitterness began to simmer. The crime that changed everything. While Tarquin ruled with calculated severity, it was his son, Sextus Tarquinius, who committed the crime that shattered the monarchy. The story told by Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus centers on a woman named Lucretia, the wife of a Roman nobleman, Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. She was renowned for her chastity and virtue, the model of a Roman matron. One evening, as Roman officers relaxed after battle, a debate arose about whose wife was most virtuous. They rode to Rome unannounced to observe them. While the others were feasting or resting, Lucretia was found weaving with her handmaidens late into the night, pure, industrious, and modest. This display impressed all, especially Sextus. But what followed was no courtship. Inflamed by desire and jealous pride, Sextus returned to Lucretia's home days later, demanding her compliance under threat. If she did not sleep with him, he would kill her and a male servant, then claim he'd caught them in adultery, a dishonor that would stain her family forever. Lucretia, faced with impossible choices, submitted to the assault. The next day, she summoned her father, her husband, and their friend Brutus. With quiet dignity, she told them what had happened. She begged for justice. Then, without waiting for vengeance to arrive, she drew a dagger and killed herself so that no Roman woman might ever cite her example to excuse dishonor. The outrage spreads. The reaction was immediate and seismic. Roman values were rooted in virtus and pietas, the honor of the family, the virtue of the wife, the duty to the gods and the state. Lucretia's death was not only a personal tragedy, it was a political catalyst. Lucius Junius Brutus, a relative of the king but also a man underestimated and overlooked, stepped forward. Until that moment, he had played the fool, acting simple-minded to avoid royal suspicion. But at Lucretia's funeral, Brutus seized the moment. He held the bloody dagger aloft and swore an oath. Never again would Rome suffer the rule of a king. He called on the citizens to rise up not just for Lucretia, but for the republic yet to be born. Tarquin, campaigning in nearby Ardea, was caught unaware. The Roman people, incited by Brutus and Collatinus, refused to allow his return. The army, loyal to the city more than the king, also turned. The gates were barred. The Senate declared the monarchy abolished. Tarquin and his family were exiled. He sought allies, but Rome had moved on. The monarchy had fallen not through civil war, but through collective civic revulsion. The founders of the Republic. Brutus and Collatinus became the first consuls of the Roman Republic, elected to rule jointly for 1 year. This was not just a symbolic choice, it was a blueprint for the future. Power would now be shared, not concentrated. Terms would be limited, not lifelong. Leaders would be elected, not appointed by birth or God. But from the beginning, contradictions emerged. Collatinus, despite his service, bore the Tarquinius name. Distrust lingered. Brutus, seeking to protect the young republic from even the appearance of monarchy, forced his colleague to resign. Collatinus withdrew and was replaced. Even Brutus's own sons plotted to restore the Tarquins. When the conspiracy was discovered, Brutus condemned his sons to death, watching silently as they were executed for treason. This was not mere cruelty, it was a statement. The Republic would demand loyalty, even at the cost of blood. Institutional replacements. The monarchy was dismantled, but Rome did not abandon the functions of kingship, only the title. Many royal duties were absorbed by new offices. Consuls replaced kings as military and civic leaders, with equal powers and mutual veto. The Senate gained influence as an advisory and financial body. The Pontifex Maximus took over religious responsibilities, ensuring rituals continued uninterrupted. The Rex Sacrorum, king of sacred rites, was a new priestly office with no political power, created specifically to maintain royal rituals without reviving royal authority. Even the fasces, the symbol of imperium, a bundle of rods and an axe carried by lictors, were retained by consuls. Rome didn't erase monarchy. It disassembled it, redistributed it, and rebranded it. Exile and retaliation. Tarquin was not content to live in quiet exile. He sought aid from Etruscan allies and attempted to retake Rome by force. Several battles followed, including the Battle of Silva Arcia, where Brutus met Tarquin's forces in the field. Brutus was killed in combat, defending the republic he helped found. His death was mourned as heroic sacrifice. Rome held its first public funeral for a consul, laying the foundations of civic virtue, duty to the state above self, and certainly above family. Tarquin's final attempt to return came with the help of Lars Porsena, king of Clusium, who besieged Rome. Though the city was nearly taken, it held firm thanks in part to patriotic resistance from figures like Horatius Coccles, who defended a bridge single-handedly, and Gaius Mucius Scaevola, who famously burned his own hand to show Roman bravery. Eventually, Tarquin faded from history. No longer king, no longer feared, he became a warning, a story, a symbol of what must be prevented. The meaning of never again. The Roman hatred of kingship became institutional and cultural. The word rex, king, became almost taboo in political life. No one could hold absolute power unless under extreme emergency, such as when a dictator was appointed, for 6 months only, in times of dire crisis. Leaders were expected to dress modestly, speak humbly, and reject personal glory. But underneath this aversion to monarchy lay a strange paradox. Rome's greatest achievements would come under emperors, monarchs in all but name. The memory of Tarquin haunted every ambitious general, every populist leader, and every reformer. Caesar would later be killed for appearing too royal. Augustus would rule as emperor while calling himself princeps, the first citizen. Rome never truly escaped monarchy. It disguised it, repackaged it, and lived in tension with it. The Tarquin legacy. The monarchy had ended, but its impact remained. Rome's religious calendar still bore the marks of Numa's reforms. The Servian classes formed the basis of republican military organization. The Temple of Jupiter, begun under Tarquin the Proud, became the spiritual heart of the city. The early republic did not throw away its past, it adapted it. Kings were gone, but their functions were woven into a complex political system designed to avoid tyranny while maintaining continuity. And that, perhaps, is what makes Rome's transition so unique. It was not merely a change of ruler, it was the invention of a new kind of state, born not from philosophy or theory, but from revulsion at abuse and respect for structure. Unresolved ending thought. As Rome stood on the edge of a new era, one had to ask, could a city that defined itself by what it was not ruled by a king, not dominated by tyranny, survive the pressures of expansion, ambition, and inequality? Or would the ghost of Tarquin one day return in another form? The monarchy was gone. The people had sworn an oath no more kings. The Tarquins had been cast into exile, their attempts to return repelled, and a republic was born. Yet Rome's identity was not wiped clean by revolution. Instead, the city retained much of its monarchical structure, carefully recast, repurposed, and rebranded under new names and limitations. This final section explores how the early Roman Republic adapted the legacy of the kings while obsessively avoiding the reemergence of tyranny. Through tradition, legal innovation, and social tension, Rome forged a state both haunted by its past and defined by it. A republic engineered from fear. At the heart of the new government was not utopian idealism, but strategic fear specifically, a fear of concentrated power. Rome's early constitution did not spring from philosophical treatises or democratic experiments. It was a product of pragmatism, designed to prevent the return of Tarquin the Proud or anyone like him. Thus, Rome created a system with overlapping magistracies, short terms, and mutual vetoes. The consuls, Rome's highest officials, served for only 1 year and had to share power. Neither could act unilaterally. Each consul could veto the other. This design made swift decision-making difficult, but that was the point. Stability came not from efficiency, but from the deliberate slowness of Roman politics, a safeguard against tyranny. Every decision passed through layers. The Senate for deliberation, the assemblies for ratification, the consuls for execution. Even military command was constrained. Outside the city walls, consuls had imperium, but within the sacred boundary of Rome, the pomerium, their power was curtailed. No standing army, no marching soldiers. Even victory parades, triumphs, required special permission. Filling the void of kingship. Though Rome rejected kingship in name, it had to replace the essential functions of the king. 1. Military command. Consuls led the army, but only with Senate approval and for limited campaigns. In extreme emergencies, the Senate could appoint a dictator, a single ruler, for 6 months only. He could act without veto or appeal, but the office expired automatically. This temporary concentration of power was one of Rome's most cautious innovations. Acknowledge that tyranny may be necessary, but only briefly. 2. Religious duties. The king had been Rome's chief priest. To preserve ritual continuity, the office of Rex Sacrorum was created. This figure performed royal religious duties, but was stripped of all political authority. The Pontifex Maximus became the true spiritual leader over time, organizing festivals, interpreting omens, and overseeing the religious calendar. 3. Judicial authority. Early kings had judged disputes and handed down sentences. In the Republic, This function moved to praetors, elected officials who presided over courts and codified precedent. By slicing the king's powers into multiple roles, Rome avoided reconcentration. Each magistrate did part of what the king once did, but none could do it all. Kings in memory and myth. Though detested in political life, the kings of Rome remained central to Roman identity. This paradox defined Roman culture for centuries. Kings were feared as tyrants, revered as founders, cited in law and ritual. Their names lived on in places: the Servian Wall, the Cloaca Maxima, institutions, the Curiae, the centuries, and stories, Lucretia, Horatius, Brutus. Romans told and retold these tales not only to explain their past, but to reinforce the boundaries of acceptable power. Each king became a moral lesson. Romulus, power creates cities but invites bloodshed. Numa, peace and religion civilize nations. Tullus, militarism without piety invites divine wrath. Ancus, balance builds bridges. Tarquinius Priscus, foreigners can rule justly. Servius Tullius, merit can rise. Tarquinius Superbus, arrogance destroys everything. This mythic structure, half history, half cautionary tale, was a political education for future generations. The word rex becomes a curse. No legacy was more enduring or more potent than the revulsion toward the word rex, king. It became an accusation, not a title. Political rivals were smeared with it. Ambitious leaders went out of their way to avoid even the appearance of kingship. This fear shaped every major turning point in Roman history. When Spurius Cassius proposed a land reform law in 486 BCE, opponents accused him of seeking a crown. He was executed. When Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, a war hero, advocated for debt relief in 384 BCE, he was branded a would-be tyrant and hurled from the Tarpeian Rock. When Julius Caesar accepted honors that resembled monarchy, including lifetime dictatorship, he was stabbed by senators, including another Brutus, in a scene that mirrored Rome's earliest rebellion. The Republic's core identity was anti-monarchical, but that didn't mean the people were immune to powerful figures. In fact, charismatic generals, wealthy patrons, and populous tribunes often pushed the boundaries of legal authority. Rome, it turned out, loved order, feared kings, but admired power. The king's shadow in the people's hands. The early republic saw a growing power struggle between patricians and plebeians. While aristocrats clung to inherited privilege, the common citizens demanded more representation and protection. This dynamic played out through a long series of reforms. Tribunes of the plebs, established 494 BCE, gained the power to veto laws and protect plebeians from abuses. The 12 Tables, 450 BCE, codified basic rights and limitations. Over time, plebeians gained access to all major offices, including the consulship. Ironically, some of the most powerful individuals in Rome would arise from these commoner ranks, not by seeking kingship, but by becoming champions of the people, or populars. This opened a path for ambitious leaders who looked like republicans but acted like monarchs. The republic had preserved freedom from monarchy but not equality, and not peace. Rituals of resistance, remembering the fall. To reinforce the lessons of monarchy's failure, Romans embedded reminders into their civic calendar and ceremonies. The Lupercalia, held in February near the cave where Romulus and Remus were said to have been nursed by the she-wolf, honored their founding myth. The Festival of Rigifugum, Flight of the King, observed every February 24, commemorated the expulsion of Tarquin. A symbolic king would perform rites and then be formally exiled, reenacting the banishment of monarchy from the city. Triumphs, the great parades awarded to victorious generals, were carefully regulated to prevent overreach. Even at the height of glory, the general stood behind a slave who whispered, Memento mori, remember, you are mortal. These rituals were not just tradition. They were state therapy civic exercises in humility, boundaries, and memory. The king returns, but not yet. Despite all safeguards, the pattern of centralized power reasserted itself. As Rome expanded, the Republic's framework struggled to accommodate its growing empire. Powerful generals like Marius, Sulla, and later Caesar amassed personal armies and challenged the state. Populist reforms threatened senatorial control. The balance of power between assemblies, tribunes, and senate began to fracture. Still, for centuries, the idea of monarchy remained politically radioactive. Even when Augustus became emperor in 27 BCE, he carefully avoided the title Rex. Instead, he called himself Princeps, the first citizen. His rule was absolute but wrapped in republican vocabulary. The ghost of the kings had returned, but cloaked in new language. The true legacy of Rome's kings. The fall of the monarchy was not the birth of freedom, it was the beginning of accountability. Rome's republic was built on a paradox. It owed everything to its kings, yet defined itself by their absence. Kings taught Rome how to rule, build, fight, and pray. The republic taught Rome how to limit, share, and question power. The obsession with kingship never disappeared. It reemerged in every crisis, every reform, every civil war. The republic endured for nearly 5 centuries not because it erased monarchy, but because it never stopped fearing it. And in the end, that fear proved prophetic. Final reflection. If the republic was born in reaction to tyranny, and its entire structure built to prevent a return to monarchy, how did Rome centuries later so willingly embrace an emperor? Was it exhaustion, ambition, or something embedded deep within the Roman soul? The belief that, in the end, order, no matter how absolute, was worth the cost. Story 3: 12 Tables and Wooden Plows. Daily life in the early republic. By the 5th century BCE, Rome had thrown off the yoke of kingship and embraced its new identity as a republic. But beneath the layers of consuls, senators, and tribunes lived the real Rome: farmers, laborers, mothers, craftsmen, and soldiers. Their voices do not survive in inscriptions or marble busts. They survive instead in fragments of law, in ruins of homes, in the deep grooves worn into cobbled streets. This section pulls away from the grand political narrative and peers, instead into the daily rhythms of early republican life. What did it mean to live in Rome before it became an empire? What were the duties, pleasures, and petty grievances of the average Roman? To answer that, we must examine Rome's earliest legal code, walk its muddy lanes, and listen for the echoes of ordinary voices long silenced but not forgotten. The 12 Tables, carving order into bronze. In 451 BCE, after years of pressure from the plebeians, Rome created its first public, written laws, the 12 Tables. These were not visionary legal philosophy like Hammurabi's Code or modern constitutions. They were a list of practical, sometimes brutal, rules meant to standardize justice across classes. Why now? Because for decades the patrician magistrates had administered law in secret, often to their own benefit. The plebeians, lacking written rules, had no recourse against biased rulings. Law was memory, and memory could be manipulated. The 12 Tables were written by a special board of 10 officials decemviri, who posted them on wooden tablets in the forum for all to see. Later, they were cast in bronze. Though the original tablets are long lost, later Roman writers quoted parts of them. Some examples reflect how mundane, yet essential, Roman law was. If a man breaks another man's limb, let there be retaliation. If a man owes a debt and does not pay, he may be seized and bound. No person shall hold nocturnal meetings in the city. Women, even though adult, shall remain under guardianship. These laws regulated property, marriage, contracts, family life, burial practices, and criminal punishment. They reflected a society deeply concerned with stability, honor, and predictability. Justice, however, was not equal. The laws allowed the enslavement of debtors, limited intermarriage between patricians and plebeians until repealed, and emphasized the authority of the male head of household, the paterfamilias, above all else. But for the plebeians, having the law visible fixed in metal and stone was a step toward fairness. No longer could a judge invent a rule to serve his allies. Rome was learning how to rule by law, not by whim. The Roman house, hearth and authority. The average Roman lived in a domus, not the luxurious urban mansion of later imperial Rome, but a modest, often one-room dwelling made of mud brick and timber, especially outside the wealthier center. The home was not a private retreat, it was a moral institution. At its center was the hearth, sacred to Vesta, goddess of the fire. Surrounding it were the Lares and Penates, household gods believed to guard the family and pantry. At the head stood the paterfamilias, a father, literally and legally. His authority, patria potestas, was total. He arranged marriages. He could disown children. He conducted religious rituals. He held legal power over his wife and children's lives even to the point of execution, though rarely exercised. This was less about tyranny and more about structure. Romans believed that the state mirrored the household and that a strong Rome required strong, disciplined homes. Women, while subordinate in law, exercised considerable informal power, managing the home, arranging social ties, and preserving family honor. Roman matrons were praised for virtues like pudicitia, modesty, industria, diligence, and gravitas, seriousness. Work, wealth, and wooden plows. Early Republican Rome was a society of farmers. Citizenship was closely tied to land ownership, and military service was based on property class. The Roman ideal was the yeoman farmer, a citizen soldier who labored by day, fought by campaign, and voted in assemblies. Fields were plowed with wooden tools, often iron-tipped, pulled by oxen. Wheat, barley, olives, and grapes were staple crops. Most farming was subsistence-based, though surplus was traded in local markets. The work was backbreaking and uncertain. Drought, war, or raiding neighbors could destroy a family's fortune. There were no banks, no insurance. Instead, Romans relied on extended family, religious vows, and community support. Artisans, potters, tanners, and metalworkers plied trades near the forum. Markets buzzed with bartering. Carts filled with amphorae rumbled down stone streets. Roads were unpaved, slippery in rain and filled with dung, but commerce grew steadily. Slavery was already present. Enslaved people came from conquered villages or unpaid debts. In the early republic, they often worked alongside free farmers rather than on massive estates. Their legal status was low, but manumission freedom was possible, and freed slaves could, in time, become citizens. Religion in daily life, gods in the grain. Every Roman action was entwined with ritual. Farming, politics, marriage, and birth all came with prescribed prayers, sacrifices, and taboos. Before plowing a field, a farmer would offer a cake or wine to Tellus, the earth goddess. Before any journey, even to the next village, one might consult an augur, a priest who interpreted the flight of birds. City festivals, like the Lupercalia or Saturnalia, brought temporary breaks from routine and strict social order. Religion was transactional. You gave the gods proper offerings, do ut des, I give so that you may give, and they provided safety, crops, or success. It was less about belief and more about precision. Getting a word wrong in a prayer could invalidate it. Even within the home, religion was ever present. Each family kept small shrines, and meals began with brief invocations. Death was not the end of a Roman's obligations. Funerals included coin offerings for Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, and continued monthly sacrifices at tombs. Children, education, and discipline. Children were raised to imitate adult Roman values from a young age. Boys were taught farming, warfare, and oratory. Girls learned weaving, household management, and modesty. Formal schooling was rare and limited to elite families. Education, where available, took place at home or under a pedagogue, a slave tutor. Literacy was not widespread, but practical knowledge of contracts, rituals, and civic duties was expected. Corporal punishment was normal. Stoicism before pain was a sign of strength. Roman children witnessed public rituals, attended funerals, and were included in religious life early on. Marriage occurred young, often arranged. Girls could be married by their early teens. Marriage was more about alliance than romance. Love poems and affection would come later in elite circles, but the early republic prized duty over desire. Entertainment and escape. Despite its seriousness, early Roman life was not without leisure. Public games were held on festival days, foot races, wrestling, and early versions of chariot races. Storytelling was common around hearths, reciting family history, myths, or local legends. Dice games, music, and communal feasts provided breaks from toil. Evenings were short, most rose with the sun and slept shortly after dark. Oil lamps were expensive, and night was viewed with suspicion. Curfews and bans on nocturnal meetings reflected fears of unrest. But within these restrictions, Romans carved out moments of joy. A good harvest, a child's birth, a successful barter, these were victories worth celebrating. A world of boundaries and belonging. Early Republican Rome was a world of strict lines. Between patrician and plebeian. Between citizen and slave. Between family duty and state duty. Between sacred and profane. Yet within these boundaries there was a deep sense of shared identity. Romans believed they were part of a collective, not individuals in isolation. Your worth was defined by your role: farmer, soldier, mother, son, and how well you fulfilled it. The 12 Tables codified this world, not as an ideal but as a reflection, harsh, hierarchical, and unembellished, but also clear, communal, and rooted in continuity. Unresolved ending thought. If early Roman life was built on rigid duty and shared struggle, how would this system respond to change when conquests brought wealth, cities swelled, and tradition met ambition? Would these simple wooden plows and bronze tablets survive the weight of empire? By the 4th century BCE, Rome was no longer merely a cluster of farms and huts clustered on 7 hills. The Republic had begun expanding militarily and economically. Rome was fighting wars, absorbing rival Latin cities, and building alliances that hinted at its growing regional power. But while consuls celebrated victories and senators debated treaties, the average Roman, especially the plebeian, still struggled under the burden of debt, military service, and inequality. This section explores the internal pressures of the early republic, how its ordinary citizens bore the costs of its survival, and how the system, though rigid, was forced to adapt. We will see the reality of the Roman countryside, the demands of war, the rise of protest movements, and the ways law and power were contested in the forum and in the fields. A city of soldiers and creditors. Rome's security and its expansion depended on its citizen soldiers. Military service was compulsory for land-owning males, often for multiple campaigns each year. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and craftsmen, pulled from their fields during the crucial growing season. Rome offered no standing army pay in these early centuries. Soldiers were expected to supply their own equipment and to return home in time for the harvest. But as wars grew longer and campaigns ranged farther from the city, this system became increasingly unsustainable. The cost: debt. Many plebeian farmers, having left their fields fallow during war, returned to find crops failed, animals lost, and creditors waiting. Roman law permitted harsh penalties for debt default. Seizure of land. Forced labor. even bondage, where a debtor could be imprisoned or enslaved until the debt was repaid. This system created a cycle. Service created debt, debt reduced independence, and dependence increased social inequality. And yet, these plebeians were the very people fighting Rome's battles. The first secession, plebeian power awakens. By 494 BCE, tensions reached a breaking point. Plebeians, frustrated by debt, lack of political representation, and legal inequality, withdrew from the city in an act of mass protest known as the First Secession of the Plebs. They marched to the sacred mount outside the city and declared they would form their own community unless the patricians addressed their grievances. The patricians panicked. Rome could not function without its farmers, craftsmen, and especially its soldiers. The standoff ended not with violence but with compromise. The tribunes of the plebs were created elected officials with the power to veto actions by magistrates that harmed plebeians. Tribunes were sacrosanct. Anyone who harmed them could be lawfully killed. They could summon plebeians to assemblies and propose legislation. It was an extraordinary step. For the first time, a formal mechanism existed to protect the interests of common citizens. It was not equality, but it was leverage. The Republic had survived its first constitutional crisis, and its system of tension, balance, and negotiation was born. Farming under pressure. While politics played out in the Forum, the majority of Romans remained tied to the land. The Ager Romanus, or Roman countryside, was dotted with small plots worked by free citizens. These smallholders, sometimes called assidui, formed the backbone of the army and the soul of Roman identity. But their hold on land was precarious. Failed crops, enemy raids, or legal disputes could push a family into destitution. Land could not be easily reclaimed once lost. Wealthy patricians often acquired abandoned land, creating larger estates, latifundia, worked by slaves or tenant farmers. Government aid was minimal. Grain prices fluctuated wildly depending on harvests. Roads were rough, irrigation primitive, and agricultural knowledge largely empirical. Oxen and wooden plows were the tools of survival. Yet rural Romans remained deeply invested in the Republic. Their land tied them to their identity. Voting assemblies were arranged by wealth and military class, and landowners had voice even if unequal. The tribes and centuries through which citizens voted often reflected their geographic origins and income brackets. Women in the shadows of law. Roman law did not view women as independent legal entities. Whether daughter, wife, or widow, a woman remained under the guardianship of a man, first her father, then her husband, or another male relative. Marriage manus involved the transfer of authority from father to husband. In the early Republic, this could include property rights, legal control, and even religious duties. A woman could not vote or hold office. And yet, Roman women, especially from wealthy or influential plebeian families, wielded quiet power. They managed households and finances. They educated sons in Roman values. They influenced marriages, inheritances, and political networks. In urban areas, women might engage in textile work, market exchange, or religious life. Vestal virgins, though few, held unique autonomy. They were priestesses of Vesta, sworn to 30 years of celibacy and civic duty, and free from male guardianship. While not legally equal, Roman women were socially essential, and their influence behind the scenes often shaped alliances, peace treaties, and family fortunes. The law evolves, 12 tables and beyond. The creation of the 12 tables in 450 BCE did not end legal inequality, but it marked a crucial step. Plebeians could now read the law and cite it. They could appeal unfair judgments and demand equal treatment in contracts. Yet the laws also revealed the Republic's brutal realism. Death was a common punishment. Children born with deformities were to be exposed. A thief caught at night could be lawfully killed. Debt bondage remained legal. Still, plebeians used the law as a weapon of protest. In the centuries that followed, they would push for reforms. Lex Candlelight, 445 BCE, allowed intermarriage between patricians and plebeians. Licinial-section laws, 367 BCE, required that one of the consuls be plebeian. Lex Hortensia, 287 BCE, made resolutions passed by the plebeian assembly binding on all citizens. Bit by bit, Rome's laws began to reflect the reality of its people, not because of benevolent rulers, but because of collective pressure and protest. The cost of expansion. As Rome began asserting dominance over neighboring Latin cities and tribes, military service increased. Campaigns dragged on. War booty enriched commanders and patricians more than soldiers. This placed further strain on small farmers. Absent from home, they missed critical planting and harvest periods. Returning in debt, they often sold land or fell into arrears. Displaced, many moved into the city, creating early urban poverty and instability. Rome's economy grew, but so did inequality. Veterans without land became a political issue, one that would later fuel the reforms of the Gracchi brothers and the rise of populist generals like Marius. But even in this early period, the pattern was forming. Rome's victories abroad often created tensions at home. Class tension and cultural unity. Despite class conflict, Roman culture worked hard to project unity. This was done through religious festivals open to all citizens, public games, ludi, sponsored by magistrates to earn favor with the masses, myths and legends, retold to promote shared values, Romulus, Horatius at the bridge, Lucretia. The Roman calendar, filled with rituals, honored both gods and civic history. The poor might live in rough housing and struggle for food, but they were still Romans, with the right to vote, serve, worship, and appeal. This complex blend of exclusion and inclusion allowed the Republic to survive crises that might have torn other states apart. Civic identity, more than law. What bound early Romans together, even through inequality, was a shared civic ethos. Every citizen, rich or poor, was taught to fight for Rome, to respect its traditions, to honor its gods, to fear kingship, to sacrifice personal interest for res publica, the public thing. Even tribunes born of protest worked within the system. There was no revolution, only reform, slow and loud. Rome was not a democracy. It was a structured oligarchy with participatory elements. But within its limits, ordinary citizens carved out power through persistence, solidarity, and civic pride. Unresolved ending thought. As the Roman Republic expanded, its armies marching farther, its conquests growing richer, could this fragile balance between patrician control and plebeian participation hold? Or was the Republic already, in these earliest days, setting the stage for the very inequality it claimed to guard against? Having examined the foundations of early Roman law and the struggles of the plebeians, we now turn to the daily rhythms that define the Roman Republic at the ground level. In this final section, we explore the infrastructure, habits, beliefs, and community practices that allowed ordinary Romans to endure hardship, maintain identity, and build a society that could expand beyond the Tiber Valley and conquer much of the known world. The Rome of the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE was not yet imperial. It was still earthy, hardworking, unequal, and deeply practical. But it was also united by rituals, roads, and resilience, a collective commitment to enduring order, even when it wasn't always fair. Markets and meeting places, the forum as a living heart. Every day, life in the city of Rome revolved around the Forum Romanum, a rectangular plaza surrounded by government buildings, temples, and shops. While modern eyes might see only ruins, Ancient Romans saw it as their civic and social engine. In the early Republic, the Forum was a marketplace where fishmongers, butchers, weavers, and farmers sold goods. A courtroom where trials took place under open skies before the rostra speaker's platform. A temple district with shrines to Saturn, Vesta, and other gods lining its edges. A political space where assemblies gathered and magistrates made proclamations. Plebeians mingled with patricians here. Slaves ran errands for their masters. Lictors cleared paths for consuls. Vendors shouted. Philosophers debated. Beggars sought alms. The smell of baked bread mixed with animal dung and incense. The Forum was messy, a place where the city's contradictions coexisted. Wealth and poverty, justice and favoritism, law and tradition. But it was also where Rome's identity was forged, day after day, transaction by transaction. Roads and rural life, life beyond the walls. Rome's earliest roads were not paved with empire in mind. They were practical routes, paths trampled by carts and hooves, later cobbled with stone for durability. The most famous, the Via Appia, was begun in 312 BCE, connecting Rome to southern Italy. These roads served multiple functions. Military movement, troops could march swiftly. Trade, grain, wine, oil, and livestock moved between city and countryside. Civic control, roads allowed the Republic to govern newly absorbed territories. For rural Romans, however, the experience was different. Life was quiet, repetitive, and deeply seasonal. Spring, plowing and sowing. Summer, weeding and maintenance. Autumn, harvest. Winter, repair, rest, and indoor labor. Tools were simple: wooden plows, iron sickles, stone mills. Storage pits preserved grain. Clay amphorae held oil and wine. Homes were small, often with animals living under the same roof. Villages were self-regulating. Elders resolved disputes. Local shrines anchored ritual life. News from Rome might come by travelers or not at all. For these Romans, the Republic was both near in identity and far in visibility. Festivities and faith, living with the gods. Religion in Republican Rome was not mystical, it was procedural, public, and practical. There was no priesthood class ruling over divine secrets. Instead, ritual was everyone's responsibility, especially that of civic leaders. Every Roman knew key dates on the calendar. Lupercalia, February, celebrated fertility and purification. Saturnalia, December, a reversal of roles: slaves dined first, masters served. Venalia, Robigalia, and Consualia, agricultural festivals honoring wine, crops, and stored grain. Participation was civic. A poorly performed ritual could offend the gods not just personally, but collectively, leading to plague, defeat, or famine. The pontifices and augurs were the religious functionaries of the Republic. They maintained the calendar, oversaw public sacrifice, interpreted divine will from lightning, bird flights, or entrails. But private worship was equally important. Each household honored the Lares, ancestral spirits, and Penates, guardians of the pantry. Death anniversaries included libations, food offerings, and storytelling. Romans did not seek emotional union with gods. They sought contractual peace, a divine status quo. This kept ritual precise, unemotional, and deeply conservative. Education and the oral tradition. Formal education was limited and often private. The wealthy hired tutors, often Greek slaves. Most children learned through observation, memorization, and imitation. Roman education focused on moral instruction, learning what it meant to be Roman. Oratory, how to speak in court or assembly. Law and contracts, especially for boys entering public life. Reading and writing, in Latin and later Greek. Girls were often taught domestic management and basic literacy. But all Roman children were expected to learn history and custom not from books, but from stories passed through generations. It was in these retellings that Roman values were reinforced: bravery, piety, loyalty, severity. From bedtime tales of Horatius cockles defending the bridge to public funerals reciting ancestors' achievements, Rome was a culture of memory, and memory was instruction. Family lineage and the power of names. Roman identity was intergenerational. One did not simply live for oneself, but for the family name nomen. Lineage determined everything. Social standing, political opportunity, marriage prospects, legal expectations. Elite families kept imaginese wax masks of ancestors displayed during funerals and processions. These were not portraits, but symbols of continuity. The gens, or clan, united extended families under a shared name and origin myth. Some claimed descent from gods or Trojan heroes. These myths were not historical, they were aspirational. Even commoners took pride in modest ancestry. My grandfather farmed this land. It was a society where legacy mattered more than innovation. Discipline, dignity, and the Roman character. The defining Roman value was discipline, disciplina. From military drills to family structure, order was everything. Other closely linked virtues included gravitas, seriousness and self-control; fides, faithfulness and reliability; pietas, duty to gods, family and country; virtus, courage and excellence, especially in men. These weren't just moral values, they were public expectations. A Roman who failed to embody them risked shame, the ultimate social sanction. Even punishment reinforced this ethos. A soldier who fled might be executed by decimation, every 10th man killed. A citizen who defrauded the state might be whipped, exiled, or enslaved. The law did not aim for rehabilitation. It demanded order. But Romans did not view this as harshness. They saw it as necessary structure in a world of chaos. It was this mindset, tough, communal, tradition-bound, that enabled Rome to endure, adapt, and expand. From local citizenship to global conquest. As the 3rd century BCE began, Rome's ambition stretched beyond the Italian peninsula. Wars with Samnites, Gauls, and Etruscans had taught it resilience. Victory brought spoils, slaves, and land, but it also brought questions. Could small farmers survive in a city growing rich from conquest? Could traditions hold when wealth changed expectations? Could plebeians remain empowered in a system still dominated by old names? Rome would soon face its greatest foreign rival, Carthage. But equally important were the internal tensions, economic, legal, cultural, that came from its own success. The simple wooden plow, the bronze tablets of law, the mud brick homes, they built a republic strong enough to expand. But would they be enough to hold it together? Final reflection. If the Roman Republic was held aloft by rituals, rural grit, and the belief in shared identity, how would it fare when that identity was challenged by empire, ambition, and inequality? Would the old values endure or crumble under the weight of their own contradictions? Story 4: Grain, Galleys, and Grit, the First Punic War. In the 3rd century BCE, Rome was still a land power, forged on hills, plowed with oxen, and ruled by men whose families measured honor in acres and scars. It had bested its neighbors, Latins, Samnites, Etruscans, Gauls, through slow attrition, stubborn defense, and alliances that stretched across the Italian peninsula. But now Rome was poised for something it had never attempted before: a war overseas. The opponent, Carthage, a maritime powerhouse of ancient wealth, Phoenician origin, and unmatched naval supremacy. The stage, Sicily, an island of strategic ports, fertile soil, and contested loyalties. What began as a local dispute in Messana would explode into a war that lasted over 2 decades, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and forced Rome to transform from a landlocked republic into a naval empire. This section begins the long, grinding story of the First Punic War, 264–241 BCE, a war not of glory, but of logistics, learning, and losses. It is the story of how a republic built on grain and discipline found itself building warships, storming islands, and confronting the cost of expansion. The island between giants. Sicily sat at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade, a land of abundant harvests, wealthy cities, and strategic naval routes. Three powers eyed it jealously. Carthage, based in North Africa, had colonies across the western Mediterranean. It ruled the sea through a powerful navy and a network of client cities. Syracuse, a Greek city-state, held southeastern Sicily and often shifted allegiances to maintain independence. Rome, though not yet a naval power, had just completed the conquest of the Italian peninsula. Rome had no ambitions for overseas conquest, but the balance of power was fragile. The spark came from Messana, a city at the northeastern tip of Sicily. Its control of the Strait of Messina, the narrow passage between Italy and Sicily, made it militarily and economically vital. A mercenary group called the Mamertines, originally from Campania, had seized the city. When under threat from Syracuse, they appealed for help to both Carthage and Rome. Carthage arrived first and garrisoned the city. Rome faced a dilemma: accept the Mamertines' plea and risk war with Carthage, or do nothing and allow a rival to strengthen its hold near Italy. Despite internal hesitation and the moral ambiguity of aiding pirates, Rome chose intervention. The Senate was divided, but the popular assembly overruled. A consul was dispatched to Sicily. Rome had committed to its first foreign war. The Punic threat. Punic from pony, the Latin word for Phoenicians, was how the Romans referred to Carthaginians. To Roman eyes, Carthage was wealthy, secretive, and un-Roman. It relied on mercenaries, not citizen soldiers. It conducted diplomacy through gold, not alliance. Its language, religion, and customs were alien. But Carthage was no weak trading post. It was a naval hegemon with hundreds of ships, fortified harbors, and influence across Sardinia, Corsica, and North Africa. The Carthaginian army was cosmopolitan. Numidian cavalry, Iberian swordsmen, Gallic mercenaries, and African spearmen fought under a complex command structure. Its navy, meanwhile, was feared for its maneuverable quinquiremes, five-rowed warships operated with deadly precision. Rome, by contrast, had no fleet to speak of. Its navy consisted of transport ships and coastal vessels. Its soldiers had never fought a sea war. Yet Rome rarely saw lack of experience as a barrier. It saw it as a temporary disadvantage, something to be corrected by sheer determination. Building a navy from scratch. Facing a maritime war, the Romans made an extraordinary decision: build a fleet from nothing. According to Polybius, they captured a Carthaginian quinquireme and used it as a blueprint. Shipwrights and laborers from coastal allies were pressed into service. Rome began building hundreds of warships, despite having little native timber or expertise. What Rome lacked in tradition, it made up for in innovation. They added a device called the corvus, crow, a boarding ramp with a spike that could be dropped onto enemy decks, turning naval battles into infantry brawls, an arena where Roman discipline excelled. Within a few years, Rome had produced a navy capable of confronting Carthage. It was an astounding transformation akin to a landlocked farming society building an air force in a generation. The grinding war begins. The First Punic War was not a campaign, it was a series of sieges, naval battles, and land skirmishes that spanned over 20 years. It unfolded in three key theaters. Sicily, the heart of the conflict. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Roman soldiers, unused to long sieges, often struggled to capture walled settlements. The sea, Rome's new navy faced mixed success. Initial defeats were common, but over time, Roman seamanship improved, aided by the corvus and sheer manpower. North Africa. In a bold move, Rome invaded Carthaginian territory near the war's midpoint, nearly ending the war prematurely. One of the earliest Roman triumphs came at the Battle of Mylae, 260 BCE, where consul Gaius Duilius used the Corvus to capture over 30 Carthaginian ships. This proved Rome could win at sea, though not without cost. Naval warfare was brutal. Storms wrecked fleets, hundreds drowned. In 255 BCE, over 100,000 Roman sailors were lost in a single storm. Rome rebuilt its fleet, then rebuilt it again. The war would see hundreds of thousands of deaths, yet neither side could deliver a final blow. It became a war of attrition and endurance, testing supply lines, engineering, and public patience. Siege warfare and the Roman learning curve. Carthaginian cities in Sicily were well fortified. Their defenders were professional and often had superior siege technology. Rome, relying on a citizen army more accustomed to open battle, had to learn quickly how to build siege towers and battering rams, how to cut off supply lines without exposing troops, how to sustain long operations far from home. Roman commanders made mistakes, but they learned. Each failure became a blueprint for improvement. Perhaps the most famous siege was that of Lilybaeum, a critical Carthaginian port. Despite years of effort, Rome could not take the city by force. It became a symbol of the war's stubbornness, neither side able to concede, neither willing to relent. The Carthaginians, meanwhile, relied on skilled generals like Hamilcar Barca, father of Hannibal, who harassed Roman positions through guerrilla tactics and night raids. Still, Rome refused to abandon Sicily. Financial and human cost. The First Punic War nearly bankrupted both sides. Rome funded its navy through emergency taxes and forced contributions from allies. Carthage relied on its merchant elite, who often had more interest in trade than war. For ordinary Romans, the war meant increased taxation, especially among property owners, continuous military service, often for a decade or more, loss of sons, brothers, and neighbors to sea and disease. Despite the hardship, Rome's resilience never wavered. The Senate raised new fleets, citizens donated gold and silver, allies remained loyal, bound by treaties and Roman promises of eventual land and citizenship. This was not a war of ideology. It was a war of grit, fought not for glory but control of a key island and the economic lifelines that flowed through it. Unresolved ending thought. As the war dragged on with no clear end in sight, one could not help but ask, could a republic built for land war, governed by cautious magistrates and citizen assemblies, truly master the seas? Or would the very effort to fight Carthage begin to change Rome itself? By the early 250s BCE, Rome and Carthage had been locked in war for over a decade. The prize, Sicily, remained undecided. The cost, human, financial, and psychological, was rising. What had begun as a limited intervention had become an unrelenting struggle for dominance across land and sea. This section tells the story of Rome's transformation under pressure, how a land-based power pushed itself to master naval warfare, how missteps led to massive losses, and how perseverance, more than strategy, began to tilt the balance. Along the way, we see how this war stretched the fabric of the Republic and reshaped its very character. Roman naval innovation and disaster. Rome's first tentative naval victories in the 260s BCE had demonstrated potential, but the transition from army to navy was never smooth. Victory at Mylae had been encouraging, but it gave way to one of the most disastrous naval defeats in Roman history at the Battle of Drepana in 249 BCE. Commanded by Publius Claudius Pulcher, a consul from a noble patrician family, the Roman fleet sailed against the Carthaginian navy near the western tip of Sicily. Pulcher, impatient and dismissive of religious rituals, ignored the auspices, the sacred signs traditionally read from the behavior of birds. When the chickens used for the augury refused to eat, Pulcher famously declared, "If they will not eat, let them drink," and threw them overboard. It was a disastrous omen and a disastrous day. The Carthaginian navy, led by Adherbal, executed a well-timed counterattack. Rome lost 93 ships and thousands of sailors. It wasn't the first defeat, nor would it be the last, but Pulcher's sacrilegious arrogance outraged the Senate. He was recalled, tried, and fined a rare rebuke to a patrician consul. Still, the pattern was clear. Inexperience, overconfidence, and stormy seas plagued the Roman navy. Storms at sea, nature's indifference. Perhaps worse than enemy action were the storms. In a period before accurate forecasting or navigational instruments, Roman fleets were astonishingly vulnerable. In 255 BCE, after an unsuccessful invasion of North Africa, the Romans attempted to bring their army home. While crossing the Mediterranean, they were caught in a storm off the coast of Sicily. Over 270 ships were lost. Estimates suggest as many as 100,000 men drowned. It was the worst maritime disaster in Roman history. And yet, incredibly, Rome responded not with retreat but with rebuilding. The Senate levied taxes, citizens contributed their wealth, shipyards operated continuously. Within a year, a new fleet was ready. To the Carthaginians, this was madness. To the Romans, it was normal. This speaks to a deep Roman trait, refusal to concede. Losses were met not with despair, but with labor. Rome did not build its empire on perfect plans, it built it on relentless effort. Hamilcar Barca and the War of Position. In the later years of the war, Rome's strategy shifted toward attrition. Carthage, however, found new leadership in Hamilcar Barca, a brilliant general and father of the future Hannibal. Hamilcar didn't seek decisive battles. Instead, he led a mobile guerrilla campaign across western Sicily, harassing Roman forces, defending key fortresses, and striking where least expected. He built a base on Mount Irkt, high and difficult to access. From here, he launched raids along the coast and blocked Roman supply lines. He even landed forces in southern Italy, seeking to stir rebellion among Rome's allies, though unsuccessfully. His aim was not to defeat Rome outright, but to make the war too costly. Carthage, increasingly strained financially, hoped Rome would eventually negotiate. But the Roman Senate would not yet. Financing war, the Senate, the allies, and the burden. Rome's resilience came at a price. Maintaining fleets, armies, and distant sieges required a constant stream of grain, timber, iron, and silver. The burden was carried by Italian allies, socii, who provided men and material despite having little say in decisions. Wealthy citizens, who were expected to loan money or donate ships. Farmers, who faced disrupted harvests due to conscription and raids. Tax provinces, where grain was extracted to feed armies. Interestingly, Rome did not tax its citizens directly during the Republic's early period. Instead, it relied on tributum, a wartime levy, and publicani, private contractors who collected revenue and supplied armies in exchange for state contracts. Rome's system was clunky, unequal, and at times predatory. But it worked because the Senate was willing to invest in long-term war, and because Roman citizens, while suffering, still believed in the promise of victory and spoils. The Siege of Lilybaeum, a study in stubbornness. Nowhere was the character of the First Punic War more evident than at the Siege of Lilybaeum, 250–241 BCE, a heavily fortified Carthaginian port on Sicily's western coast. The siege lasted nearly a decade, with neither side able to deliver a decisive blow. The Carthaginians reinforced the city through clever blockade running. Roman engineers tried to collapse the walls, dig tunnels, and block the harbor, all with limited success. This wasn't a battle of glory. It was a grind, a slow strangulation. Soldiers died from disease and exhaustion more than combat. The city became a symbol. If Lilybaeum fell, so would Carthaginian Sicily. Rome eventually built a breakwater to block the port. It didn't work. They tried to bribe the garrison. That failed. It was only with eventual naval victories elsewhere that the city was rendered irrelevant. Still, the siege exemplified Rome's approach. If one method failed, try another and another and another. The final Roman gamble, Battle of the Aegates Islands. After nearly 23 years of war, Carthage was exhausted. Its elite citizens were reluctant to fund more campaigns. Its generals, though skilled, lacked support. Rome, too, was broke but not beaten. In 242 BCE, the Senate took a bold step. They privately financed a new fleet, funded by wealthy citizens who believed victory was within reach. It was an investment not in coin, but in Roman supremacy. This fleet was commanded by Gaius Lutatius Catulus, a new kind of naval leader, methodical, prepared, and restrained. He trained his crews, repaired old ships, and blockaded the Carthaginian fleet near the Aegates Islands off Sicily. On March 10, 241 BCE, the Carthaginians attempted to break the blockade with an undercrewed, hastily assembled fleet carrying supplies to the Lilybaeum garrison. The Romans struck decisively. Over 50 Carthaginian ships were sunk. 70 more were captured. Carthaginian reinforcements were destroyed. The city of Lilybaeum, now cut off, could no longer hold out. The First Punic War had reached its end not with the fall of a city, but with the control of a supply line. Rome had learned to think like a maritime power. The peace and its price. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were harsh. They surrendered all holdings in Sicily. They paid a massive indemnity in silver. They agreed not to attack Rome's allies. Rome, in turn, gained its first province, Sicily. It now needed governors, garrisons, and grain administrators. This was a turning point. Rome was no longer just a peninsula-bound republic. It now had overseas obligations, taxes, and imperial headaches. The First Punic War had changed Rome. It had forced the republic to build fleets, sustain long wars abroad, manage diverse populations. The traditions of the early republic, wooden plows, citizen soldiers, annual consuls, had proven flexible. But how long could they hold? Unresolved ending thought. Rome had won the war, but at what cost? Was victory at sea a transformation or a corruption of Roman virtue? Could a republic built on simplicity and sacrifice maintain its identity while ruling foreign lands and sailing foreign waters? After 23 grinding years, the First Punic War was over. Rome had achieved the unimaginable victory over the greatest naval power of the Western Mediterranean. It had done so not through brilliance or speed, but through sheer, unrelenting persistence. Yet peace did not bring rest. Instead, it brought administrative headaches, economic strain, and new enemies. For Carthage, the defeat was humiliating but not final. Beneath the ashes of war, a slow-burning anger smoldered, especially in the heart of one Carthaginian general's family, the Barcas. This final section explores the long-term consequences of the First Punic War, how it reshaped the Roman Republic into a more imperial power, destabilized Carthage, and planted the seeds for the even bloodier Second Punic War, where Hannibal would cross the Alps, and vengeance would become a legacy. After the war, the making of a Roman province. With Sicily under Roman control, a major transformation began. Rome had never ruled foreign territory before. Italy was a patchwork of allies and colonies bound by treaties. But now, Rome needed to govern non-Italic people, collect tribute, manage trade, and enforce laws. So, in 241 BCE, Rome established Sicilia as its first province. Key features of provincial governance included a Roman governor praetor, who wielded both civil and military authority. Taxes and grain levies, collected from Sicilian cities. Limited autonomy for loyal cities, but with oversight. No citizenship for most Sicilians, just obligations. Rome didn't install a heavy bureaucratic system. Instead, it relied on local elites to manage affairs under Roman oversight. This light touch approach minimized resistance, but maximized resource extraction, especially grain, now a staple of Roman provisioning. Sicily became the Republic's breadbasket, fueling both its armies and urban population. But it also became a precedent. Rome could rule provinces and profit from them. The economic and human toll on Rome. Though victorious, Rome emerged scarred from the First Punic War. Casualties were staggering. Estimates suggest that Rome lost over 300,000 men, a devastating number for a population of a few million. Financially, the Republic was stretched thin. Massive naval losses required constant rebuilding. Emergency levies and war bonds had burdened the elite. Infrastructure across Italy had been neglected during decades of war. To address this, Rome leaned harder on its Italian allies, extracting grain, men, and resources. Tensions simmered. Some allies began to chafe at the unequal burden of war. Meanwhile, returning veterans found their farms in ruin, taken over by creditors or neglected beyond recovery. Many migrated to cities, especially Rome, forming a new landless urban poor that would later influence the political instability of the late Republic. Victory, it turned out, had a price measured not only in silver and soil, but in social cohesion. The Carthaginian crisis. If Rome suffered, Carthage nearly collapsed. Defeat in Sicily had cost it prestige, revenue, and credibility. But worse, Carthage now faced internal rebellion. Its army, largely made up of unpaid mercenaries, returned home demanding back wages. Carthaginian officials, strapped for silver, refused. The result was the Mercenary War, also called the Libyan War, 241–237 BCE, a brutal and terrifying conflict in which Carthage had to fight its own former soldiers, who were soon joined by rebellious African towns and Numidian allies. The war was horrific. Mercenaries seized towns and massacred civilians. Carthaginian commanders used torture and starvation in retaliation. Entire cities were burned. Some prisoners were crucified. The war ended only with the intervention of Hamilcar Barca, who outmaneuvered the rebels and restored order. His brutal but effective leadership saved Carthage from annihilation. But the crisis revealed a deeper truth. Carthage's reliance on mercenaries had made it vulnerable. Its oligarchic government, dominated by wealthy merchant families, was ill-equipped for prolonged land warfare. Yet one man had emerged with reputation intact: Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar's vow and the birth of vengeance. When Carthage sued for peace in 241 BCE, Hamilcar had not been the one to surrender. He believed Carthage had been betrayed by its weak civilian leaders, and that the war had ended too early. Legend, likely apocryphal but widely believed, claims that Hamilcar took his young son, Hannibal, to the temple of Baal and made him swear an oath never to be a friend to Rome. It's likely this was a later invention. Still, the emotional truth of it resonated. Hamilcar hated Rome. His family, the Barcas, would devote their lives to revering Carthage's humiliation. Hamilcar looked west, toward Iberia, modern Spain, a rich land of silver, soldiers, and opportunity. With Rome distracted by new conflicts in the Adriatic and Gaul, Hamilcar quietly built a new Carthaginian power base. He conquered local tribes, founded cities including New Carthage, modern Cartagena, and created a self-sustaining military machine, funded by Iberian silver and loyal to the Barcas, not Carthage's Senate. Rome didn't notice or didn't care. Rome's New World. In the years following the First Punic War, Rome found itself drawn into new wars. The Illyrian Wars, 229–219 BCE. Rome began policing the Adriatic Sea against piracy, asserting its naval power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Gallic Wars in northern Italy, c. 225 BCE. Rome fought migrating Gallic tribes, securing the Po Valley. The annexation of Sardinia and Corsica, 238 BCE. During Carthage's civil war, Rome seized these islands, exploiting Carthage's weakness. It was an opportunistic move, and it deeply embittered Carthage. Though relatively minor campaigns, these conflicts did two things. They normalized overseas intervention. They accustomed Rome to military occupation and revenue extraction from non-Italic peoples. The Roman state was no longer a coalition of Italian towns. It was becoming a Mediterranean empire. The forgotten, ordinary people in the First Punic War. Amid these grand transformations, it's easy to forget the lives of ordinary people who bore the brunt of the First Punic War. Farmers conscripted for years, their fields abandoned or seized. Sailors, many of whom had never seen open water before the war, drowned in storms or fought in terrifying shipboard melees. Women and elders, left behind to manage households, communities, and debts. Allied communities, whose sons died in wars decided far from their homelands. There are no surviving letters, no memoirs from the war's common soldiers, but we can imagine the impact. Families broken, towns depopulated, communities taxed and pressed into Rome's ambitions. The First Punic War was not a war of heroes. It was a war of administrators, engineers, sailors, and supply chains. It taught Rome how to manage suffering and how to expect it. The long shadow toward the Second Punic War. Though peace had come, it was an uneasy one. Rome had humiliated Carthage, seized its territories, and disrupted its economy. Carthage, in turn, rebuilt itself in Spain, outside Rome's formal control. The two powers had not settled their rivalry, they had simply paused it. By the early 220s BCE, tensions returned. Rome made treaties limiting Carthaginian expansion. Carthage, under Hannibal, tested those limits. Then in 218 BCE, Hannibal attacked the Roman-allied city of Saguntum. Rome demanded his surrender. Carthage refused. The Second Punic War had begun. And this time, Carthage would strike first and with fury. Final reflection. The First Punic War was not about glory. It was about learning to survive far from home, to fight without tradition, and to suffer without surrender. It was about how Rome became something it never set out to be, an empire, and how in doing so it created enemies who would never forget. Rome won the war, but did it lose something of itself along the way? Story 5. The censors ledger life, death, and taxes in the Roman Republic. Beneath Rome's great wars and monumental architecture was a quiet, powerful institution, one that rarely makes headlines in popular history. It had no legions. It didn't build roads or conquer Gauls. And yet it shaped nearly every Roman life, from the humblest farmer to the most powerful senator. It was the Roman census, and at its heart stood one of the most unusual and influential offices in the Republic, the censor. This section explores how the Romans managed their growing population and resources not through ideology, but through lists, ledgers, and labels. We'll walk through the job of the censor, the origins of the census, and what it meant to be counted in Rome not just numerically, but morally and politically. The origins of the census, counting citizens in the age of kings. The idea of the census is far older than the Republic itself. According to Roman tradition, the census was established by Servius Tullius, the sixth king of Rome, reigned c. 578–535 BCE. Servius, it is said, divided the Roman people into classes not by birth but by wealth. Each citizen was assigned to a centuria, a voting and military unit, based on their income and assets. This classification determined how much tax they owed, what military equipment they were expected to provide, how much political power they held in elections. The result was a society graded like a spreadsheet where citizenship was both a duty and a number. Of course, this legendary origin is murky, but we know that by the early Republic, a formalized system of classification and counting was in place. It was, in many ways, the engine of Rome's expansion. You could not raise legions, assign taxes, or build roads without knowing how many citizens you had and how much they could pay. The censor, a strange and sacred office. The censor was a unique magistrate in the Roman system, elected every 5 years, and only for a period of 18 months. 2 censors were always elected together, both former consuls. They had no military command, no imperium, but they held immense moral and administrative power. Their primary duties were conducting the census, maintaining the rolls of the Senate and equestrian class, granting state contracts called publica, overseeing public morality, cura morum. This last duty gave them a reputation for stern conservatism. Censors could expel senators for dishonorable conduct, demote equestrians, and penalize immoral citizens. They were, in a sense, Rome's bureaucrats and priests of virtue. The census itself, ritual and bureaucracy. The census was not just a form or a tax roll, it was a sacred rite. It took place in the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, where citizens would gather before the censors in a formal parade. Each citizen would appear with his family and slaves, state his name, age, property holdings, and dependents, declare his patrimony, everything he owned, including land, livestock, jewelry, and even tools, accept his assigned class and voting bloc. For most Romans, this was a moment of anxiety and pride. To be undercounted meant losing status. To be overcounted meant paying more. At the end of the process, the censors would perform a purification ritual called the lustrum, a symbolic cleansing of the people. It gave its name to the 5-year interval between censuses. Even in its most mundane parts, the census was about order, morality, and the boundaries of belonging. Who was counted? The census counted male Roman citizens, their wives, children, and slaves as dependents, their property, especially land and movable wealth, their geographic residence for organizational purposes. But the census also excluded women as individuals. They were counted only in relation to their husbands or fathers. Slaves as persons, they were property. Foreigners, unless granted some form of limited citizenship. Freedmen, liberated slaves, were counted but in separate roles. The result was a narrow definition of the Roman state, one that saw citizenship as tied to land, lineage, and male virtue. The 5 classes and the ladder of status. Based on the census, Roman citizens were sorted into 5 classes, each subdivided into centuries. Class I, the wealthiest, who provided cavalry and heavy infantry. Class IV, the middle ranks, who provided infantry with diminishing armor. Class V, the poorest, often used as slingers or light troops or exempted from service. Capite censi, counted by the head those with no property. These were not placed into centuries at all and had almost no political voice. This wasn't just a military system, it was a political one. In the Comitia Centuriata, Rome's main voting assembly, centuries voted in a strict order. The wealthiest classes voted first and often determined the outcome before the lower classes even spoke. Thus, the census didn't just record inequality, it institutionalized it. the censor as moral watchdog. Beyond numbers, the censors acted as guardians of Roman values. Their powers included expelling senators for behavior deemed unworthy drunkenness, cowardice, corruption, revoking equestrian status from horse-owning elites who failed their duties, reprimanding citizens who lived extravagantly or divorced excessively, publishing edicts promoting traditional virtues, thrift, simplicity, loyalty. This power, called nota censoria, the censor's mark, was both admired and feared. One famous case involved Cato the Elder, who as censor in 184 BCE attacked luxury with zeal. He taxed clothing, horses, and statues. He expelled senators for public kissing or excessive spending. He banned Greek philosophers from Rome. To Cato, the census was about more than numbers. It was about preserving Roman masculinity and frugality values he saw slipping as Rome grew richer. Not all agreed, but few dared to challenge the censors directly. Contracts and corruption. One overlooked power of the censors was their control over state contracts. They auctioned public works, road construction, bridge repairs, aqueducts, temple maintenance. These contracts went to the publicani, wealthy contractors who bid for the rights. In return, they collected tolls or taxes and were expected to complete the work. This system enabled vast infrastructure growth, encouraged private initiative, also enabled corruption, favoritism, and abuse. Publicani often overcharged provinces, bribed officials, or delayed work. Censors were meant to keep them honest, but censors themselves were not immune to bribery. Thus, the very office charged with moral order often danced with economic disorder. Census and empire. As Rome expanded, the census became increasingly difficult to administer. Citizens were scattered across colonies, provinces, and battlefronts. New territories had no voting rights, but still needed to be categorized and taxed. Italian allies, until the Social War in 9188 BCE, were not counted as citizens, creating resentment. By the late Republic, the system was buckling under its own weight. And yet it endured. Even Augustus, Rome's first emperor, held the title of censor in all but name. He conducted censuses, revised the Senate, and used the data to reward or punish cities across the empire. In time, the census would become an imperial tool of control and extraction, but its heart remained the same: to know who you ruled and how much they were worth. Unresolved ending thought. The Roman census was not just about knowing the people, it was about shaping them. By counting citizens, labeling them, and ranking them, Rome turned society into a ledger. But as the Republic expanded, could this system of classification keep pace with an empire that no longer fit its formulas? The Roman census was more than just a head count. It was a framework for belonging, a way to measure citizenship, define virtue, and bind a growing population to the state. This is the story of how counting people became a tool of unification, division, and ultimately, transformation. From city-state to republic, managing belonging in a growing Rome. In the early Republic, Rome was little more than a city-state surrounded by enemies. Its citizens were mostly small landholders within a few dozen miles of the city. Census records were relatively simple. But as Rome grew by alliance, conquest, and colonization, the task of defining who was Roman became vastly more complex. By the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, Rome controlled much of central Italy. Its solution was the socii system, a web of treaties with local communities that allowed autonomy in exchange for military service and loyalty. However, these allies were not citizens. They were counted, but separately. They fought Rome's wars and paid Rome's taxes, but did not vote, could not run for office, and were not included in the census proper. As Rome expanded, its census created a growing divide. Those inside the civic ledger, cives Romani, enjoyed legal protections and political power. Those outside, socii and peregrini, were subjects of obligation, not inclusion. The census thus reinforced a sense of identity that was rigid, hierarchical, and exclusionary, even as the Republic claimed to be a beacon of shared governance. The census as a tool of political manipulation. Because the census determined political classification, it could be, and often was, weaponized. Take the example of Gaius Flaminius, a populist tribune and later consul, who in 232 BCE passed a law to distribute conquered Gallic lands to poor Roman citizens. The elite hated this. Why? Because more land for the poor meant more citizens with property right, new entries in the census rolls. More rural voters, challenges to aristocratic control in assemblies. A shift in the voting blocks, potentially empowering reformers. Later, censors could retaliate by assigning certain citizens to less powerful centuries, or by questioning their property declarations. They could curb the influence of reformist movements without ever touching a sword. The census, in effect, became a tool of soft repression, powerful enough to silence dissenters without violence, subtle enough to seem like administration. The Gracchi and the crisis of inclusion. In the late 2nd century BCE, the Republic faced a reckoning. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, two brothers from a prominent family, attempted to reform land ownership and extend citizenship, rights particularly to Italians excluded from the census. Their logic was simple. Rome needed more soldiers, more people needed land. Italy was carrying the Republic's burdens, Italians deserved a voice. The census was too narrow, excluding millions who supported Rome. Their reforms challenged the very premise of the Roman census, that political power should be reserved for a small, landowning class. The Senate responded with force. Tiberius was clubbed to death in 133 BCE. Gaius was killed in 121 BCE. Still, the pressure continued to mount. The social war, census rebellion. The most dramatic census crisis came during the Social War, 91-88 BCE. Rome's Italian allies, Latins, Sabines, Samnites, and others had fought alongside Rome for centuries, but they had no voting rights, no access to magistracies, and no inclusion in the main census classes. In 91 BCE, after the murder of reformer Marcus Livius Drusus, who had proposed granting citizenship to all Italians, the Allies rebelled. This was not a barbarian invasion. It was a civil war over access to citizenship and census inclusion. The war was brutal. Cities that had once been loyal raised arms against Rome. Rome responded with sieges, executions, and the destruction of towns. In the end, Rome granted citizenship to most Italians, first to those who had remained loyal, then to others as a means to end the war. Suddenly, Rome had millions of new citizens to count. The next census would reflect a vastly changed state, but the infrastructure to manage such a transformation was already strained. Administrative anxiety. Can the census scale? After the Social War, Rome faced a new problem: how to manage a census system built for a city-state, now applied to a continent. Challenges included distance. Citizens now lived hundreds of miles from Rome. How could they report in person? Fraud and evasion. Many avoided registration or falsified assets. Record keeping. No centralized bureaucracy. Ledgers were kept on wax tablets and papyrus scrolls stored in temples. Inequality. Even though the Italians were citizens, they were often relegated to distant tribes in the voting order, minimizing their influence. The administrative structure buckled under the weight of empire. The last free republican census, was held in 70 BCE. Later censuses under emperors would become more ceremonial, designed to legitimize authority rather than truly catalog the people. Slaves, freedmen, and the hidden majority. One major omission in the census was the vast population of enslaved people. Rome's slave economy exploded during the late Republic. After each conquest, thousands were enslaved. Large estates, latifundia, in Sicily, Gaul, and Spain were worked by bonded labor. Urban slaves served in domestic, clerical, and even managerial roles. Slaves were not citizens, they were property, but they shaped every aspect of Roman life. They built roads. They taught elite children. They managed households and businesses. Even freedmen, once emancipated, were counted in the census, but always marked as former slaves, liberty. They had limited rights and were often assigned to low-status tribes. Thus, Rome's census not only excluded the enslaved, it codified a permanent second-class status for those who escaped bondage. Counting women indirectly. Women were not counted as individual political actors in the census. Instead, they were included under the household head's declaration, valued in terms of dowries or inherited property if widowed, absent from formal class rankings. Yet women played a critical economic and social role as landowners, business patrons, and educators. Elite women, in particular, often controlled vast fortunes through inheritance. But in the census, they were invisible. This exclusion reinforced the idea that citizenship equals military and political service equals male. It would take the empire and imperial women to challenge this idea later. Final use in the Republic, Augustus and the imperial pivot. The last major use of the Republican-style census came under Augustus, who styled himself not as king, but as first among equals, princeps. Augustus held multiple censuses, including the famous one of 2 BCE, which he used to show that he had restored moral order, reorganized the Senate, promote civic virtue and family values. He also instituted a marriage law, offering incentives for producing children, again linking census data to state policy and morality. But after Augustus, the true power of the census waned. It became a tool of empire, not republic, more focused on taxation than political classification, removed from direct citizen participation, managed by imperial bureaucrats, not elected censors. The ledger remained, but the republic it once served had vanished. Unresolved thought. By attempting to count and categorize every citizen, the Roman Republic hoped to build a state defined by order and hierarchy. But in doing so, it sowed the seeds of resentment and rebellion. Can a republic truly endure when its very system of inclusion creates so many degrees of exclusion? By the end of the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic had collapsed. Civil wars, political assassinations, and deep inequalities had torn the old system apart. But amid all the chaos, one ancient institution persisted, quietly ticking forward like the gears of an aging machine: the census. We follow the afterlife of the Republican census, how it transformed under Augustus, endured through imperial reforms, and eventually evolved into something far removed from its civic roots. We explore the practical, symbolic, and psychological legacy of the census, not only in ancient Rome, but also in the modern bureaucracies that echo its logic. Augustus and the census as legitimacy. In 28 BCE, Augustus, Rome's first emperor, conducted the first imperial census with his colleague Marcus Agrippa. This was more than an administrative act, it was a ritual of legitimacy. By holding the census, Augustus signaled a return to order and tradition after civil war, the restoration of the Republic, a fiction he carefully maintained. His role not as a dictator, but as a guardian of Roman values. He repeated the census in 8 BCE and again in 14 CE, shortly before his death. Each time the lustrum purification was performed, and each time Augustus carefully curated the data to emphasize the size, strength, and moral fiber of the Roman citizenry. The actual numbers were massive. By Augustus' own account, over 4 million citizens were recorded in his final census. This was up from roughly 900,000 during the Republic. Yet much of this growth came not from birth, but from expanding citizenship, especially after the Social War and Caesar's earlier reforms. The census now served not to limit citizenship, but to legitimize imperial rule. From civic duty to fiscal tool. As the Republic faded, so too did the civic soul of the census. Under the Empire, the comitia centuriata no longer functioned meaningfully. Voting blocks and property classes became ceremonial. Moral oversight, once the censor's domain, shifted to imperial edicts. What remained was the economic heart of the census. Taxation. Citizens and non-citizens alike were assessed for land, labor, and poll taxes. Military service. Recruitment still drew on census data to determine eligibility. Labor obligations. Especially in the provinces, censuses were used to track who owed service to the state. In the provinces, local officials, often under imperial prefects, conducted their own censuses, sending data back to Rome. Yet this system was no longer a Roman institution for Romans. It had become a colonial tool, used to extract wealth, labor, and loyalty from millions across the empire. The provincial census, a logistical marvel and nightmare. Managing a census across 3 continents was no small feat. Under emperors like Vespasian and Trajan, census administration became more standardized, often linked to new roads, legal systems, and registries. Key features of the imperial census system included tax districts, civitates, each responsible for self-reporting. Registrars, tabularii, to record and store declarations. Oaths of honesty, with harsh penalties for false statements. Periodic reviews every 14-20 years, depending on location. In Egypt, for example, the letter 1F00 pi omicron gamma rho alpha phi eta, epigraph, system required households to register all family members, property, and even livestock. Some documents survive written on papyrus listing. Names, ages, and family relations. Occupations and slave ownership. Statements like, "There are no strangers in this house." These records are eerily modern, resembling tax returns or census forms from today. But unlike modern censuses, Rome's process was often coercive. Avoiding registration could lead to fines, land seizure, or even imprisonment. The case of Bethlehem, a biblical echo. One of the most famous references to a Roman census appears in the Gospel of Luke, which claims, "In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world." This decree allegedly forced Joseph and Mary to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. Historians debate the accuracy of this account, but it reflects something deeper. Roman censuses were felt even in the most remote villages. The need to register for taxation, especially under Roman rule in Judea, created economic burdens, social tensions, and at times rebellion. In fact, a later census under Quirinius in 6 CE sparked a revolt led by Judas of Galilee, who objected to Roman control and taxation. Census taking had become a symbol of imperial intrusion, not civic pride. Decline and transformation, from census to capitation. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman state was in crisis. Civil wars weakened administrative systems. Inflation undermined tax collection. Massive population shifts, Invasions and plagues disrupted records. In response, emperors like Diocletian, R 284-305 CE, reformed the census system. Diocletian's reforms tied people more tightly to their place of birth, introduced capitatio, a fixed poll tax based on census data, created a system where families, trades, and regions were locked into obligations for generations. This led to a quasi-feudal structure. Farmers became serfs, bound to the land. Professions became hereditary. Mobility was discouraged to keep tax records accurate. The census had become a tool of control, reinforcing stability at the cost of freedom. After Rome, the medieval echoes. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, the tradition of the census faded in the West, but it did not vanish. In the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, censuses continued for centuries, often in the form of cadasters, land registers. In Western Europe, rulers periodically attempted surveys and taxation rolls, such as the Domesday Book, 1086 CE, in Norman England, which closely resembles a Roman cadastral census. The Capitulaire de Villiers of Charlemagne, outlining duties and inventories of royal estates. These were not true censuses in the Roman sense, but they carried the same logic: count the people, measure their worth, and assign their obligations. Even in modern times, national censuses owe their conceptual origins to Rome's innovation. Legacy: the modern state and the ghost of the censor. Today, every country conducts some form of census. We fill out forms, declare our property, state our professions, and account for our households. Few pause to consider that we are reenacting a tradition that began with a ritual on the Campus Martius 2.5 millennia ago. Rome taught the world that data creates power. Counting citizens defines citizenship. Ledgers are more lasting than laws. Even when democracy fades, the habit of classifying people endures. Yet Rome's census also warns us. Bureaucracy, if not tied to justice, becomes oppression. Classification can entrench inequality. When a state knows everything about its people, it may begin to treat them as assets, not citizens. Final reflection: when the list becomes the law. The Roman Republic began with the idea that shared governance required shared accountability. The census was its tool, a way to make democracy legible, obligations visible, and society measurable. But as the Republic became empire, the list overtook the law. Citizens became taxpayers, identities became entries, and a tool of empowerment became an instrument of control. In the end, the Roman census left behind a paradox, a vision of perfect order, always just out of reach. And so, we are left to wonder, in our own time, when every click is counted, every metric recorded, have we created a new kind of census? One that measures everything, but understands nothing. Story 6. The Water Bringers, Rome's Aqueducts and the Politics of Thirst. You stand in a Roman bathhouse. The stone is warm beneath your feet. The air hums with steam and voices. Somewhere beneath you, miles of carved tunnels and vaulted arcades are quietly delivering water from distant springs to this very room, water clean enough to bathe in, cook with, or sip without fear. It is easy to forget that this comfort was won, that it took centuries of trial, calculation, stonework, and political will to build the most extensive water infrastructure in the ancient world. This is not the story of generals or gladiators. It is the story of engineers, censors, and slaves, of limestone channels and dripping vaults, and of how the daily need for water reshaped the Roman Republic. This is the story of Rome's aqueducts. A city without a river. Rome's earliest settlers had a problem. Unlike other ancient cities like Thebes on the Nile or Babylon on the Euphrates, Rome lacked a major river for transportation and supply. The Tiber, sluggish and prone to flooding, was unsuitable for drinking due to frequent contamination. By the 4th century BCE, as Rome grew from a hilltop town into a republican power, wells and cisterns no longer sufficed. The city's population was expanding, and the Republic was trying to present itself as a center of order and civilization. But without water, there could be no city. Enter the aqueduct, a marvel of Roman compromise between engineering pragmatism and civic necessity. Aqua Appia, Rome's first aqueduct. In 312 BCE, Appius Claudius Caecus, a censor known for boldness and disregard for tradition, undertook two great projects. He built the Via Appia, the first major Roman road. He commissioned the Aqua Appia, Rome's first aqueduct. The Aqua Appia was not grand. It ran mostly underground, avoiding sabotage during wartime. It brought water just 10 miles from a spring east of Rome and terminated near the Forum Boarium, the city's cattle market. But it worked. For the first time, fresh water flowed into Rome without buckets or beasts of burden. It allowed for public fountains, improved sanitation, and supported urban growth. In hindsight, this modest aqueduct was a quiet revolution not just of infrastructure, but of political philosophy. Appius showed that Roman power could be projected through stone and water, not just arms and law. Stone gradient and the rule of gravity. Roman aqueducts relied on gravity, not pumps. Every aqueduct had to maintain a precise, shallow slope, usually around 4,800, or a drop of just over 1 foot per mile. This required careful surveying of terrain, often over dozens of miles. The building of subterranean tunnels through hills, often using vertical shafts, pudae, dug to the aqueduct level and then connected laterally. The construction of arcades, or elevated arches, when valleys needed to be crossed. Romans used tools like the corybates, a type of long level, and groma for right angles. The stone used was often travertine, a porous limestone abundant in the region. Waterproof cement, opus cementitium, lined the channels, and lead or ceramic pipes distributed the flow at the terminus. This wasn't innovation in the modern sense. Greeks and Persians had aqueducts too, but the Romans systematized the process. They made aqueducts reproducible, scalable, and civic. Public water, political power. In the Roman Republic, who controlled the water controlled the people. Aqueducts were state projects. They were built by censors, maintained by the aediles, and monitored by special officials called curators aquarum. These officials held serious power. They could fine landowners for tapping into water lines illegally, control fountains, baths, and cisterns, decide how much water went to private homes versus public services. Water was both a necessity and a reward. The elite could petition for private water lines. Meanwhile, the urban poor relied on public fountains, often inscribed with the names of the magistrates who funded them. Thus, aqueducts were not just technical works, they were political statements, etched in stone. Every arch and fountain whispered, "Rome provides." Aqua Marcia, the gold standard. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Rome had several aqueducts, but none matched the Aqua Marcia, completed in 144 BCE under Praetor Quintus Marcius Rex. It stretched nearly 60 miles, with much of it running on elevated arches, the iconic silhouette of Roman engineering. The Aqua Marcia brought cold, clean water from the Anio River Valley. It was prized above all for its quality and pressure. It allowed for high-reaching fountains, no longer just trickles, large-scale baths, eventually paving the way for the great imperial thermae, increased irrigation, improving food security within the city. In a republic obsessed with virtus, or manly virtue, the ability to provide abundant water became a metaphor for leadership. To sponsor an aqueduct was to leave a legacy stronger than war. Resistance, who paid for the pipes. Not everyone embraced aqueducts. Critics in the Senate balked at their cost, often millions of sestertii, in construction and maintenance. Landowners complained when aqueducts crossed their fields. Water rights were contested. Some argued that Rome was becoming too soft, too dependent on luxuries like piped water. And beneath the surface, literally aqueducts required brutal labor. Slaves and poor workers dug tunnels by hand, often in dangerous conditions. Maintenance crews crawled into narrow channels, removing silt and clearing blockages. Accidents were common, and fatalities often went unrecorded. So while Rome's citizens enjoyed cool baths and steady fountains, the system ran on a hidden engine of hardship. The quiet empire of stone. By the end of the Republic, Rome had 9 aqueducts supplying the city. Combined, they delivered over 200 million gallons of water per day, more than many modern cities until the 19th century. This water supported over 1 million people, the largest city in the world at the time. A culture of public bathing, hygiene, and recreation. A civic identity rooted in abundance, order, and mastery of nature. The aqueduct was Rome's true conquest not of nations, but of geography. Yet even as new aqueducts were built, problems remained. Leaks, theft, corruption, and overuse plagued the system. By the late Republic, water was no longer just a technical or civic issue, it had become a symbol of Rome's growing contradictions. Between private wealth and public good, between service and spectacle, between the Republic's ideals and its imperial destiny. Unresolved thought. Rome's aqueducts were built to serve the people, but also to control them, display power, and mask inequality. Can an infrastructure of purity remain pure when its foundations are so often laid by those without voice or reward? Water flowed steadily into Rome, but it never flowed quietly. By the late Republic, the aqueduct system had grown too vast to manage easily and too valuable to ignore. What began as a civic utility was fast becoming a political currency, a commodity tangled in corruption, crime, and class warfare. Aqueducts, once the quiet marvels of Appius Claudius, had become battlegrounds. We explore how the distribution of water and the infrastructure behind it became a site of escalating conflict. We meet the men charged with managing it, the elite who profited from it, and the poor who depended on it. The story of water in Rome is no longer just about engineering, it's about access, accountability, and abuse. The Curator Aquarum, Rome's water watchdog. The expanding aqueduct system needed oversight. That role fell to the Curator Aquarum, literally, the caretaker of the waters. Established in 11 BCE by Augustus, the position was technically an imperial post. But even before this formal office, Republican-era water oversight was handled by censors, aediles, or specially appointed magistrates. Their duties were vast. Inspect and maintain aqueducts and conduits. Enforce regulations on water use. Allocate supply between public fountains, baths, industries, and private homes. Prosecute illegal taps, leaks, and damage. Yet even with an official title, their power was limited by corruption, complexity, and political interference. One of the most notable curators was Sextus Julius Frontinus, appointed in the late 1st century CE after the Republic, but still managing the Republican-built system. In his treatise De Aquis Urbis Romi, on the waters of the city of Rome, he lamented, "Some people divert public water for their private gardens. Others tap into the conduits and steal what should flow freely to all." Frontinus approached the role with the precision of an engineer and the suspicion of a prosecutor. Illegal tapping, water theft in the Republic. Despite severe penalties, water theft was rampant. Landowners near the aqueduct routes would drill into channels, sometimes inserting lead pipes, fistulae, to siphon off water. Others bribed officials to register private connections as public fountains, thereby dodging fees. Still more operated unlicensed baths or laundries, using enormous quantities of water while paying little or nothing to the state. The consequences were uneven. The poor, reliant on public fountains, often experienced intermittent supply or lower pressure. Elite villas in the hills continued to enjoy steady flows, filtered pools, and ornamental fountains. In essence, the aqueducts created a two-tiered system, one public, one privatized, and both drawing from the same channels. Maintenance in a crumbling republic. Maintaining hundreds of miles of channels, bridges, and tunnels was a full-time, never-ending job. Key maintenance concerns included sediment buildup in conduits, cracks and leaks in mortar, structural decay of arches, especially those exposed to rain and wind, damage from tree roots, earthquakes, or sabotage. The state employed thousands of aquarii water workers who inspected channels daily, removed silt by crawling into access shafts, repaired linings using waterproof concrete, cleaned settling tanks and cisterns. Yet during times of war or fiscal strain, aqueduct maintenance was the first to be cut. By the end of the Republic, several aqueducts fell into disrepair. Entire districts went without reliable water for years. Public fountains dried up. Illegal taps flourished. And still, the Senate hesitated to invest in proper repairs. The politics of fountains. Public fountains, lacus, were the most visible sign of Rome's water network and the most politically charged. These fountains served neighborhoods where private plumbing was unavailable, became community gathering places, akin to marketplaces, were adorned with inscriptions honoring the magistrate who funded or restored them. Sponsoring a fountain became a way for politicians to gain popular favor, especially during elections. But this also led to abuse. Some officials rerouted water from other districts to feed their sponsored fountains. Others delayed maintenance until just before their candidacy, then saved the day with a repair. In poorer areas, fountains were often underfunded, while elite districts overflowed with water features and decorative basins. Thus, even clean water became a tool of manipulation. Aqueducts as class dividers. Access to private water lines was a mark of prestige. Senators, equestrians, and wealthy merchants used it to fill indoor pools and cisterns, feed ornamental gardens and fish ponds, supply private baths, often more luxurious than public ones. These taps required official approval, sometimes granted by the censor, later by the curator aquarum. However, favoritism and bribery were common. Officials might gift connections in exchange for support, contracts, or silence on other matters. Meanwhile, the urban poor relied on crowded public fountains, often with long queues, shared water carriers who filled jugs for a fee, unsanitary wells, particularly during droughts or when aqueducts failed. Thus, the aqueduct, a marvel of civic engineering, also became a mirror of Rome's social inequalities. Industrial use and water as wealth. Rome's industries were water-hungry. Phalanaki, laundries, used water to wash and bleach garments with urine-based solutions. Tanneries processed animal hide using large vats. Mills used water-powered wheels for grinding grain. These operations generated enormous profit, but often violated usage limits. Industrialists sometimes bribed inspectors to classify their taps as domestic or claimed their facilities were for public good. Some even diverted wastewater back into aqueduct conduits, contaminating public supplies and damaging morale. The state occasionally cracked down, fines were levied, channels were sealed, yet as always, enforcement was selective and inconsistent. Water, once a shared resource, had become a battleground between enterprise and equity. The question of purity. Water purity was rarely guaranteed. Although many aqueducts drew from clean springs or rivers, contamination occurred at multiple points. Leaks allowed sewage or runoff to enter conduits. Animal carcasses and debris accumulated in uncovered settling tanks. Lead pipes introduced trace toxins, though not always at dangerous levels. Medical writers like Celsus and Pliny the Elder discussed the importance of water clarity, taste, and source. They knew not all water was equal. Urban residents often developed preferences. Aqua Marcia was prized for coolness and clarity. Aqua Tepula was often mocked for being warm and sluggish. Aqua Appia, the oldest, was low in pressure and often sediment-heavy. And yet, even poor water was better than none. Crisis and reflection. By the late Republic, around the time of Julius Caesar, and the civil wars, Rome's water system was straining under its own success. Too many people, too much demand, too little accountability. Censuses were inaccurate, maintenance was neglected, and the political incentive to build new aqueducts outweighed the responsibility to care for old ones. In fact, some aqueducts had unknown routes by the 1st century BCE, their exact channels lost to overgrowth, collapse, or lack of records. Still, the water kept flowing in fits and starts, clean or foul, and Rome staggered onward. Unresolved thought. If the aqueducts were Rome's veins, what happens when no one tends the blood? Does a civilization drown in excess or die of thirst? Would you like to continue to Section 3 of Story 6? You said, "Continue." ChatGPT said, "Certainly." Open Book Story 6, The Water Bringers, Rome's Aqueducts and the Politics of Thirst. Section 3, The Empire of Water Legacy, Collapse and Lessons from Stone. Words. Water, like empire, can seem eternal until the flow stops. As the Roman Republic faded and the empire rose, aqueducts remained one of the most enduring symbols of Roman order. They survived regime change, civil war, and even indifference. For centuries after the Republic's fall, water continued to stream into the city of Rome and beyond, thanks to the vision of early engineers and the stubborn endurance of stone. But even the strongest aqueduct could not outlast neglect, nor could it withstand the entropy of a world unraveling. In this final section, we follow the aqueducts into the imperial age, into decline, and then into the ruins, and from there, consider what this quiet infrastructure tells us about civilization itself. Expansion, Rome's watershed moment. Under Augustus and his successors, the Roman Empire multiplied its aqueduct network. By the 3rd century CE, Rome boasted at least 11 major aqueducts, bringing water from sources as far as 60 miles away. These included Aqua Claudia, 52 CE, a towering achievement in stone, spanning long arcades visible even today. Annio Novus, running alongside Claudia, it was one of the highest capacity aqueducts. Aqua Traiana, 109 CE, built under Emperor Trajan, it fed the imperial baths on the Janiculum Hill. Rome wasn't the only city to benefit. As the empire expanded, aqueducts were built in Lyon Lugdunum, with multiple aqueducts traversing steep valleys on siphons. Trier and Cologne, with large systems supporting baths, fountains, and elite homes. Carthage, Antioch, and even Caesarea Maritima, demonstrating Roman engineering across continents. The aqueduct was not just infrastructure. It was imperial branding etched in arches and limestone saying, "You are now part of Rome. Rome brings water. Rome brings life." Monumental baths and the culture of abundance. Water enabled the rise of imperial baths, the thermae. Unlike earlier Republican bathhouses, which were modest, the imperial baths were vast complexes offering Hot and cold pools, libraries, lecture halls, gardens, exercise courts, and massage rooms. Famous examples include baths of Caracalla, completed 216 CE, could serve over 1,600 bathers at once. Baths of Diocletian, early 4th century, even larger, showcasing imperial wealth and might. These baths used millions of gallons of water daily, all fed by aqueducts. And yet, for all their grandeur, they required staggering maintenance of pipes, drains, heaters, and vaults. They became both centers of social life and symbols of overreach imperial decadence, supported by increasingly strained infrastructure. The cracks begin to show. By the 4th century CE, trouble was flowing into the system. The issues: earthquakes damaged long stretches of arcades. Raids by Germanic tribes in the countryside led to sabotage of aqueduct routes. The Roman treasury, strained by wars and inflation, cut funding to maintenance crews. Urban population decline meant fewer officials to monitor and regulate water use. Some aqueducts stopped functioning altogether, their sources inaccessible or their arches crumbled. Aqua Traiana, for instance, dried up intermittently due to disrepair, forcing portions of Rome to rely on wells again. Fountains went dry, baths closed, gardens withered, and with each failure Rome shrank inward both in spirit and in function. The siege and the silence. In 537 CE, during the Gothic War, the final blow came. The Goths, laying siege to Rome under King Witiges, cut the aqueducts outside the city. Their goal was simple: dehydrate the city into submission. And it worked. Without water, the baths of Diocletian and Caracalla were abandoned. Public fountains ceased to flow. Citizens drank from wells contaminated by poor drainage and waste. Even more damaging, without aqueducts to remove excess water, Rome began to flood from within. The same system that had brought abundance now magnified decay. The city, once supported by over 300 miles of channels, now staggered along with nothing but memories of flow. Medieval forgetting. For centuries after the fall of the Western Empire, Rome's aqueducts stood as stone skeletons. Locals dismantled arches for building material, farmed beneath collapsed channels, repurposed surviving conduits as pathways or sewers. Only a handful of aqueducts were kept partially functional, by the papacy primarily to feed Christian pilgrims at holy sites. The engineering knowledge needed to build or repair aqueducts vanished from Europe. In many places, people forgot even what they were for. A civilization that had once moved millions of gallons daily by gravity alone had now reverted to buckets and wells. Renaissance rediscovery. In the 15th and 16th centuries, scholars and engineers began to study Roman ruins anew. Architects like Leon Battista Alberti and engineers like Antonio da Sangallo marveled at the precision of the gradients, the durability of concrete, the planning of the routes. Aqueducts once again became a symbol of human possibility. In the 17th century, Pope Sixtus V restored sections of Aqua Alexandrina, feeding fountains in Baroque Rome, including the first versions of the Trevi Fountain. These were not simply aesthetic projects. They were acts of re-civilization, a conscious effort to reawaken the spirit of the Republic and Empire through its most useful monument, water. Lessons etched in stone. So what do Rome's aqueducts tell us, centuries later? 1. Civilization depends on invisible systems. No empire, no city, can survive long without clean water. Aqueducts remind us that it is not marble forums or conquering armies that sustain a people, it is pipes, pressure, gradients, and grit. 2. Equity is engineered. When aqueducts served all, they elevated society. When they were diverted, stolen, or neglected, they revealed rot beneath the marble. How a city manages water, who gets it, who pays, is a mirror of its justice. 3. Maintenance matters more than monuments. Rome fell not because its aqueducts failed. Its aqueducts failed because Rome stopped maintaining them. Glory fades, rust persists. 4. Simplicity is powerful. Rome moved hundreds of millions of gallons a day without a single pump, just stone, slope, and vision. There is elegance in that economy. Aqueducts today. Many Roman aqueducts still stand. Pont du Gard in France is visited by millions. Segovia's aqueduct still towers over the Spanish city, a testament to enduring form. In Rome, fragments of Aqua Claudia and Marcia cast long shadows near the Appian Way. Some are even still in use, modified, repurposed, but not dead. And in a world facing water scarcity, infrastructure breakdown, and urban overcrowding, Rome's ancient system offers a strange kind of hope. If they could do it with chisels, oxen, and gravity, so can we. Final reflection. The aqueducts flowed for 1,000 years not just with water but with ideas. They were Rome's quiet empire, without armies, without fire, just arches and stone and slope. When they failed, it was not because they were flawed, but because Rome forgot how to care for what kept it alive. In the end, we must ask ourselves, what are our aqueducts? And will we tend them, or let them crumble while we watch the fountains run dry?